I'd like us to begin by looking at the first issue, which is how do we develop effective and also equitable partnerships. So partnerships which are helpful to us perhaps in impact terms, but also equitable. And we're very lucky today, I think, to have with us Andrea Padilla and Maggy Heintz from the UK Collaborative on Development Research. Really helpful to have you both. So over to you, Andrea and Maggy.
Thank you very much, Hilary, for your introduction. We're very happy to be here with you today on this very important topic and to share ideas with other colleagues who will be also presenting today. I'll just go right to sharing my slides to tell me if that works all right. Well, our presentation with Maggy, who's also joining here today, is about highlighting a diverse range of research impact in the context of international development and the factors that contribute to their success, with a particular focus on the importance of ensuring equity in partnerships. So just as a bit of context around UKCDR, we are a collaborative on research development. We're a neutral and impartial organization that was created over 10 years ago as a result of a call to improve coordination for official development aid funded research. We are governed by the scoreboard, which is an advisory mechanism on ODA funding that comprises the chief scientific officers of our core contributing members, which you can see here at the bottom of the slide, alongside 3 independent members. And the way we do this is through 3 main pillars that help us bridge the gap between what research is conducted, what research is funded, and how research is conducted. This involves mapping, analysis, and foresight, which are a series of portfolio reports, tracking tools, and dashboards, convening for joint action, where we bring funders together on specific topics, and sharing information and best practice with documents and case studies, such as the ones that we will talk about today. And one of those is precisely one of our latest studies on the impact of UK's international development research through the results of REF 2021. So this study started a couple of years ago after the results of REF were published. What we wanted to do was to understand how development research is conducted and what type of research impact is achieved. So we took the REF submissions, which were about 6,500 case studies, and identified a sample of almost 900 of those that met our criteria of international development research. And that for us is research that addressed at least one of the SDGs for the benefit of an LMIC country, region, or globally in general. So this, as per the guidelines of REF, are case studies that showcase non-academic impact achieved between 2013 and 2020. So the way we did this was through 2 kind of complementary or parallel analysis. One was a portfolio analysis. We mapped the different trends and gaps of development research across different categories, such as which SDGs they were related to, which location they had impact, which funders were involved, which partners were involved, and what type of research users or beneficiaries they contributed to. And then on the other hand, because REF has its own limitations, we also wanted to understand a bit better the process of conducting such research. And so we did a deep dive on 10 case studies, some of which we will share with you today. These are just a few of our overall key findings or general key findings of the mapping analysis. In terms of SDGs, we identified a very strong focus on SDG 3 on good health and well-being, and SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. In terms of location, there was a clear global impact across multiple LMICs, mainly India, Kenya, and Brazil, but also high-income countries. In terms of type of impact, most of the case studies really exhibited impact on changes to policy or practice, which we call instrumental impact. I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. And in terms of funding, most research had multiple funding sources, so mainly from UK public sector, which involves UKRIs, research councils, and FCDO, but also from UK civil society organizations such as Wellcome and Leverhulme Trust, and international organizations like WHO and, well, the European Commission. And finally, in terms of partnerships, we discovered that while academic partnerships are still pretty much essential, both from high-income countries and low and middle-income countries, there is increasingly relevant partnerships both in social and natural sciences with non-academic partners, so transdisciplinary partnerships. In terms of the types of impact that were achieved, we developed this framework that is based really on existing literature. We didn't reinvent the wheel, but we wanted to recognize the different types of impact that research can achieve. And by focusing on that sample of those almost 900 projects, we identified very strong links to each and one of these ones, but as I mentioned before, mainly to instrumental impact. So just to give you an overview of what this means, conceptual impact are any changes on the ways of understanding or addressing a topic, so raising awareness, changing and shifting debates. So for example, there was one of the case studies that evidenced the link between carbon reduction and the meat industry and promoted this way and facilitated advocacy around healthy, sustainable diets. In terms of instrumental impact, well, these are, as I said before, changes to national, local, or international policies, or even industry practices. And learning and development is about strengthening capacities. So not only individual capacities, hard and soft skills of researchers or other actors involved, but also better research infrastructure or supporting an overall national research system. And finally, in terms of networks and connectivity, this is about how research can support existing platforms that bring people together or create new platforms, whether those are informal or formal, to, again, bring people or organizations together around a shared goal. Mm-hmm. The other framework that we developed throughout this research and as part of that deep dive that I mentioned is this research impact enablers framework. So this highlights 6 dimensions and 2 overarching values that underpin the achievement of research impact on development outcomes. So at the very center in purple, you can see understanding of impact. And this is about expanding the way we think about impact in terms of, well, this can happen different types of impact, as I just mentioned, but also it can happen at different geographical levels and different timescales during the implementation of research or very much post-grant. It can contribute to different users, like communities themselves or policymakers or practitioners. And there are also different scales. We can have system-wide impact or what some might call micro impacts. Then in green, you got 3 bubbles on co-production, equitable partnerships, and capacity building. And these are very much about embedding close collaboration with those who will be directly benefiting from the research, be that policymakers, practitioners, or civil society. And then in blue, underpinning those, we've got funding approaches and operational processes. And those involve mechanisms such as long-term funding and challenge-led approaches as elements that can really maximize the impact of research. So this is quite a extensive framework, and in the report you can see the different enablers that are part of each of these 6 dimensions. But just for the purpose of today's conversation, I wanted to bring to your attention a couple of examples on how this is operationalized in real life, how this is put into practice. One of the examples is from the University of Sussex on urban waste management. This was a case study that focused in India, where 90% of the waste is dumped in public spaces, so quite a large issue. And what they tried to do was analyze different perspectives and different challenges on how to manage urban waste to identify more sustainable policies and practices. What they achieved was, on one hand, a new set of guidelines, a new manual on solid waste management. They've also improved community engagement on waste-related social issues, and they encouraged more decentralized recycling with contracts between firms or private industries in Delhi and civil society organizations. And now the way they did this was through a very strong focus on identifying all of the actors in the waste management system, where in India, it's got over 1.5 million informal waste pickers working. So because of that, or realizing the importance of waste pickers as an actor, they use transdisciplinary action research. So together, academics from Sussex University and from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, they work with staff from the NGO Toxic Links. This NGO allowed them or introduced them to a series of waste picking associations, policymakers who were involved in the topic, and community members who were also very much interested in it. And they shadowed individual waste pickers at work. They interviewed residents, activists, government officials, and all of that helped them better understand the whole waste management system. It helped them build relationships across different sectors. And ultimately, the guidelines that they produce, the recommendations that they provide, were better grounded and context relevant, and really helped bridge the theory that they were developing with the practice on the ground. Apart from that, they also benefited from having a dedicated teams on project management support that really improved the reach of impact, because they help with project coordination, with monitoring, with all of the reporting activities that can be quite time consuming. And they also had a dedicated staff for communications, somebody who was there to identify and create very powerful stories in different formats and identify the best channels to disseminate that, not only in India, but in other countries around the world who were also focusing on waste management issues or circular economy issues. And then the other case study that I wanted to share is from King's College on closing the global mental health gap. So this study wanted to identify the challenges to accessing mental health in LMICs. They focused in African countries such as Ethiopia, where there are 110 psychiatrists for a population of over 100 million people. They wanted to identify how to better scale up the service provision in LMICs. And what they achieved was, raising awareness on the issue. They developed a couple of grassroots or community-based alternatives for service provision, and they informed new policies at the district level in Ethiopia, but also globally through WHO and UN guidelines. Now, the way this was achieved, and going back to the idea of the research impact enablers, was through very close engagement with those who had experienced mental illness in the communities that they were working with. They wanted to address the imbalances of academic knowledge from the research team from the UK, but while recognizing the knowledge of those local researchers and practitioners, but also from those with lived experiences. So what this looked like in practical terms is that they reached out to healthcare workers, to primary care centers and grassroots organizations with lived experience in mental health illness And together, they developed a couple of tools. The one, for example, in Ethiopia is called task sharing. And it's a model where community participants are trained in primary healthcare, and they are trained in diagnosing mental health, a diagnosis which is later confirmed by a psychiatric nurse. This supports not only the identification of people with mental health, but also at a later stage with primary care provision. Altogether, this event encouraged community people to create a new association of mental health users, and this in turn developed into new research streams and further research. Now, over to Maggy to look deeper into equity.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm putting my timer because I don't want to speak about equity for too long, but I spent almost a decade as a research manager in academia. So equity is very close to my heart because I've seen how the partnership come about with researchers from the Global North and the Global South. So I think equity is a very important topic to tackle here. So the first question you might ask is, why do we put such emphasis, or why do we focus so much on equity? Well, there is a big decolonization agenda, but there's also everything that relates to ethics in research and inclusivity. So I'm sure across this group, we can find 100 reasons as to why equity is important. But if you look at this little diagram that we have on this slide, if we put development impact at the heart of what we want to achieve, ensuring that there is equity in research partnership between the Global North and the Global South, ensures that we support research agendas that are relevant to affected community, that we allow for diversity of knowledge and experiences to inform action, and also to give participatory roles for NGOs, communities, and civil society, but also to support a research system strengthening and addressing the power imbalances that we are aware of. If you can go to next slide. So we did a bit of an exercise, and I will explain to you in the next slide or so how we came about producing this good practice document on equity. But we had a range of people that we interviewed, and we were asking about the enablers and the barriers of equity. And we came up with that representation of a tree. On the left-hand side, you've got all those factors inhibiting equity, and you've got a dying tree. And in that area, things that were mentioned by participants were things like lack of resources, disempowerment, impatience, insecurity, doubt. And on the right-hand side, when you see a nice tree flowering and all of that represents the enablers of equity. And in this area, you've got things like creativity that are mentioned, or inclusive partnership, reciprocity, and mutual respect. So on the next slide, so equity is a very timely topic. Everybody discuss equity, and UKCDR is often asked to take part in discussion around equity. And what we trialed last year was a workshop at the University of Cambridge between academics and research managers, where we were discussing equity. And it was really interesting to have in the room the two sides of the research ecosystem. So the academics who think about their research, who want to put their research forward, and then the research managers who have to deal with the operational side of doing research. And when we were discussing the common challenges that arise in terms of supporting equitable partnership, the type of things that were mentioned were operational constraints, lack of time and resource, lack of funding, or lack of capacity and time for research in LMIC settings. So I think it was very much an eye-opener to realize that even though we all want to support partnerships, there are very different barriers if you are an academic or if you are a research manager. Next slide, please. So we've, in the type of work that UKCDR does, we always go out to discuss with people, to bring to the table different perspectives. And a few years ago, we had a blog series about equitable partnership lessons from practitioners. And at the time, 6 tips were shared in terms of how we can ensure that research partnerships are equitable. The first one was in terms of focusing on planning and management from the start. So it's very much having equity in the, not even in the back of your mind, at the forefront of your mind. Equity needs to be thought about right from the start when you embark on a project. The second tip was about transparency, to be transparent about roles, responsibilities, who does what, the finances, the budget, who gets what, where is the budget managed from. The third tip was in terms of awareness, to be aware of context and sensitivities. If you undertake research in LMICs, you are most likely going to be confronted to realities that you are not familiar with. So it's very much about this context and sensitivities. The fourth tip was in terms of language support, to ensure that there is equitable partnerships in the research. And simply when you work with colleagues in Africa, for instance, whether you work in Anglophone countries or in Francophone countries, being able to speak the language of the people you work with is just so primordial. The fifth tip is in terms of supporting the establishment of alumni networks to foster future collaboration amongst researchers, so that you don't always start from ground zero and you have to rebuild everything. And the sixth and last tips that we shared at the time was in terms of providing a supportive environment to promote the well-being of researchers and research support staff, so that they have constructive relationships and can flourish. So what I'm going to touch on briefly now, because I could speak probably for hours about this document, is a best practice document that UKCDR published in partnership with Essence on Health. Essence on Health is a group of funders of research with a specific focus on health, whereas UKCDR works with the funders of research for international development. So we produced this best practice guidance together, but we also set up a task force of global research funders. And in the start of the document, we have a list of all the stakeholders that took part in this research, and it is quite comprehensive. There is a lot of researchers or funders from the African continent as well who took part in that study, for instance. The good practice document itself contains 4 interconnected approaches to support equitable research partnership alongside practical recommendation. It could almost be seen as a tick list of things to do when you embark on a project and you want to ensure that equity is embedded in your project. And the recommendations are aimed at research funders, but also research institutions and research teams. And last but not least, we do have a selection of 9 case studies in that good practice document, just highlighting how equity can be achieved. In terms of the process of the creation of this document, we had a global survey, which that's where the equity tree came from the responses from that survey. We had 5 consultative groups. We did a lot of grey literature review and the development of the case study. I always like to flag that it is not because I am French, but we did translate this document in French because we do interact with a lot of African stakeholders, and I've realized how important it is when you speak with Francophone stakeholder in Africa to be able to communicate in French. Just to show you what it looks like inside, we do have for each approach that I'm going to speak about a set of recommendations that is highlighting what a funder could be doing, what a research institution could do to support academics embarking on this type of research, and researchers themselves, what they have to be aware of or implement. Thank you, Andrea. So the first approach that we highlight in this document, we go very much from the overarching, for the macro level, to the more nitty-gritty of actually implementing equity in research partnership. So at the macro level, it's about supporting the research partnership ecosystem itself. And in this section, we highlight the value mindset. It's all about how much you value equity in the research partnership you are about to embark on, and about having a holistic approach to equity. And by that, we mean that equity has to be considered right from the moment you set the agenda. It has to be part of the funding decisions, management and leadership, but also all the way through outputs and impacts. What inputs are going to be created? How are they going to be disseminated? Who is going to be first author, for instance? Equity has to be part of the picture at every stage of the research process. In terms of addressing power imbalances, in this area, we mentioned very much LMIC leadership and ownership. We can't keep having research projects led by researchers or NGOs from the north. We very much have to be mindful of those power imbalances. We need to ensure greater involvement in LMIC institutions in policy and decision-making processes within research programs and also institutional partnership arrangements. And above all, it's also all about long-term sustainability. The 3-year funding cycle of research is not something that goes hand in hand with building equity in research partnership. Thank you, Andrea. If we go one level down, so we've looked at the research partnership ecosystem as a whole. If we go one level down, it's about strengthening research relationships and research systems. I think one thing that we don't highlight enough is that this type of research is very much a two-way learning process. It's not about the global north telling researchers in the global south what to do. We all have to learn from one another. So it's keeping again in our minds that it is a two-way learning process, and that the knowledge of context is key to have an inclusive agenda. And if we know the context of where you want to embark on your research, it's all about building mutual understanding as a starting point. Where do we start from? What are the issues? How can we relate to that? And it's also working with governments, funders, and research communities in LMICs. So it's about building a little ecosystem around the research project. It's also about knowing the political economy and the research ecosystem of the country you want to work with, and value the local knowledge and indigenous knowledge. In terms of strengthening research relationships, this is where the co-element comes in, that it is all about co-designing, co-delivering, and co-creating between the higher income country and the low and middle income country partners. Capacity building and enhancing capacity at the individual, institutional, and ecosystem level is also very important, and providing ongoing institutional capacity strengthening. Last but not least, when we speak about research relationships and research system, it's about providing investment in research management. As I mentioned at the start of my talk, I've seen firsthand as a research manager the level of support that researchers in LMIC have. In the UK, there is a little army of research managers, of contracts professional, of finance professional supporting the establishment of a research proposal, whereas the reality is that in the global south, it's often the academic who is alone. With any luck, there might be one person helping with a contract, but it's about also considering that and investing in research management. Next slide. So here I'm just going to briefly focus on one of the case studies that Andrea developed as part of a study of the REF, just to showcase how knowledge of context is key. So this is a project led by the University of Birmingham, Children Born of War. So the aim of the research project was to deepen the understanding of conflict experiences and also to conceptualize the rights of children who were fathered by foreign soldiers and born to local mother during conflicts. The impact from that project was in terms of increased understanding and awareness of children born of war experiences, informing UN policies and practices, but also improving relationship among children born of war and their communities. And in terms of NGO involvement and how an NGO can make a difference, the partner organization for this project was an NGO in Uganda, Facilitation for Peace and Development. And what came out from this partnership between researchers from the University of Birmingham and this NGO was the role of local intermediaries and how an NGO can support this type of research proposal. So FAPAD was an NGO that led to effective community engagement, improved contextual understanding, and support in recognizing and exposing human rights abuses, and also the effects of war among children born of war and their mothers. So I guess it's a typical example that without working with grassroots organizations, NGO, the research proposal probably couldn't have had the same impact because of understanding of context and knowledge of context. Thank you, Andrea. One level down, we look at budget for partnership building and how this is important to be considered when we speak about equity in research partnership. It is about supporting the development of the partnership and its co-design. And you don't often need a lot of money to ensure equity, but it all starts with little seed funding or priming envelopes of money that will enable researchers to go in country or to have some people come over just to build the partnership and to put the right actors at the table. Funding is also necessary at the back end of a project in terms of follow-on funding and to support engagement and dissemination activities and also to promote transdisciplinarity. And also one thing that funders should consider more is direct funding to LMIC institutions and researchers, as opposed to having funding that is managed by the institution in the UK, for instance. Another case study that was developed by Andrea for her project. This one is in Brazil, performing development, a project led by Queen Mary University, working with an NGO in Brazil, Redes da Mare. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. And the aim of this project was to work with communities subject to multiple stress factors and facing significant socioeconomic challenges. And the idea was to look at what type of resources could be created for resilience, resistance, and recovery. In terms of impact from this project, there was an increased global awareness on the importance of protecting indigenous cultures, but also the establishment of arts-based mental health and well-being research networks across Latin America. So this was very much an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary project. There was a collaboration between social scientists, artists, and civil society experts that enabled the exploration of the intersection of violence, poverty, mental health, geography, and the arts. And by working with a local NGO, there was a leveraging of connection of civil society organizations, and there was establishment of partnerships with non-academic organizations based on mutual benefits. Thank you, Andrea. And the final level of consideration is in terms of the implementation procedures and processes to sustain the partnership. And in that area, we want to touch on everything that relates to governance arrangement, terms of research. It's already difficult enough at times to understand the terms of research in a UK context, everything about due diligence or the costing on the intellectual property rights. So if we try and translate that in an LMIC context, we really have to be mindful of making the language understandable and that we all understand the same thing when we embark on a project. And monitoring, evaluation, and learning is also critical to ensure that the project has reached the impact that it was intended to. And finishing as we started on that reflections that we had at the University of Cambridge in that workshop with academics and research managers in terms of developing solutions to challenges in supporting equitable partnership. So it was all about looking at the existing resources, making the most of what is available, capturing and distilling institutional knowledge, people who have worked in similar contexts that would give tips to other academics, identifying the hidden barriers to equity, what is preventing us from having equity in this research partnership, and also being very mindful of power asymmetries and ensuring that there is effective communication with partners. Thank you, Andrea. And finally, we would invite you to go on our website. We do have a lot of resources in terms of equity, safeguarding, research capacity strengthening, and the fantastic studies that Andrea has been leading, the landscape of UK development research, the booklet with also case study, and the good practice guidance on equitable partnership. And do feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to discuss anything. Thank you. I don't know if I'm handing over to you,
Hilary, we
Hilary.
can't hear you.
Hello, thank you very much. It was really interesting. I wonder if there are any questions that people would like to ask, either in the chat or by raising their hand. I mean, can I start off? Do you think that a written agreement is something that's really important when you start working with an NGO or a civil society?
I think it's always worthwhile knowing where we start from. I'm always in two minds about written agreements because on one hand, it's a track as to what we want to achieve, but also at the end of the process, if we haven't delivered, if there's no contractual obligation, what is the point of it? But I think in any project, this is definitely worth starting from a common understanding. And the track might be how the research proposal evolves.
Yes. Any other questions? I'm quite interested in this idea of holistic partnership, where you're talking about you're interested in equity, not just for project leaders, but for other people as well.
Well, yeah, I think it's very important because you will always have a PI on a project, but there is so many other stakeholders that take part in a project. So I think it has to be equity at all levels, not just in terms of what the PIs on both sides are getting, but also how you're involving, the other researchers, the research assistants, the communities. I think equity in terms of whether it's within the team or within the research proposal itself, it really has to be across the whole research process.
Okay, Geraldine has a question.
Yes, thank you very much for that. It's wonderful, and I'm definitely going to make the most of those resources. But I thought I would ask, because you've mentioned that army of research managers, but as an academic, I find it quite frustrating that sometimes the institution doesn't seem to have that understanding of cultural differences that you mentioned. So I was looking for some advice about how to negotiate that side of things. If you've come across any particularly good practice, please, that would be really wonderful. Thank you.
Well, how do I respond to that? I know exactly what you mean. And it takes people to be willing to work in international development research to understand those barriers. So I think if your institution is not necessarily, backing the GCRF type thing, I think there are some hurdles to jump. I've had to jump some of those hurdles because there was a lack of understanding as to why we should, work with LMIC, for instance. I think it's bottom line, it's always having to align with the institution strategy or to find a way to make it relate to what the institution and higher management wants. But I very much hear you, and this is an issue because when GCRF and Newton came up, it was this huge pile of money that everybody wanted a slice of, but not necessarily with the proper understanding of what it entailed. So I don't have any tip, but I hear you. It is an issue.
I think if I may add to that, Maggie, I think another good approach or something that we heard about while conducting this study was how much other people's success case studies helped to make an argument and to make a case within their own institutions and show, well, actually this and that worked in this case. Can we somehow make this happen in our own institution? And as Maggie said, sometimes it's not about huge changes or big amounts of money. sometimes just initial short steps can help just create that path in a good direction.
Okay. Are there any other questions? I might be missing some, so I apologize if I am. I think that was an extremely thought-provoking beginning, if I may say so. And this idea of holistic partnership is really very challenging, and I think it's helpful to have the understanding of the work that you've done and the ability to actually utilize some of this material. So I'm really grateful to both Maggy and Andrea for doing that. Has anybody got any other questions to ask before we move on?
Yeah,
Really great
yes.
beginning. Sorry.
Jonathan.
Sorry, Jonathan. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm joining in from Canada, and I was wondering if you know if there's any equivalent to the UKCDR in Canada, because I see that you're working especially from a UK based, and your mission is like UK based mostly to enhance UK international development sector. So I was wondering if you know of an equivalent in Canada and if you work with them.
Mm.
So not to my knowledge. So UKCDR works a little bit with IDRC in Canada because we do have a lot of common interest. But in terms of a mechanism, a coordination mechanism across funders within a country, not that I'm aware of.
Mm.
Okay, thank you. I'll look for it. Thanks.
You obviously need one.
Yeah, but it's super interesting. Like everything you've given here is very interesting. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, good. Well, maybe we could move on, if that's possible now, to the second part. We're beginning to talk about equity and effective partnerships. And I think we've had some very good examples given to us, but not so far, I think, from languages scholars. So I'm really interested now to move to some of our languages colleagues who will themselves have had experience of working with NGOs or civil society and may be able to tell us something about the challenges and the opportunities that represents. So I'm delighted to introduce, to begin with, Federico Federici from UCL, who has some very considerable experience of working with NGOs. Over to you, Federico.
Okay, thank you very much, Hilary, and thank you for organizing today and for inviting me. I think there's a couple of questions in the chat that maybe could be answered later on because
okay,
they're very important for all of us, especially those about transdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary research.
Okay, right.
But I think we can also address those after I share with you my experience. So what I'm sharing is literally a sort of personal journey of conducting research in collaboration with fantastic partners. And many of those partners were allowing me to work with them as a collaborator in either funded research projects or in co-funded research projects. And I entitled my narrative of my personal experience as engaging work and committed objectives, because I think that's where we started. The work was phenomenally engaging from the point of view of my research perspective, but also there was a commitment among all of the partners to address certain research questions that mattered to everybody involved. So in the formulation of the projects I'm going to describe and cover with you, there was that idea of equity. The research questions were equally important for everybody, and that was the very starting point. And I do realize in hindsight that is a privilege and is not something that I should have ever taken for granted, because sometimes it's more difficult to achieve that shared vision. But I was lucky because my experience started, exactly 10 years ago in 2014. I was going to conduct research on the role of languages in emergency context. And then colleagues at Dublin City University, in particular Sharon O'Brien and Patrick Cadwell, gave a fantastic presentation on work that they've been doing in Kenya regarding the role of language in communicating in multilingual crisis. And we started discussing the possibility of applying for funding. And that's my starting point. We we were involving from the very beginning a number of different sectors, NGO partners, commercial partners, and I was a co-investigator. Sharon O'Brien was the principal investigators, but within Interact, I can see a sort of starting point for me to collaborate more constantly with a number of NGOs. So I will give you a sort of a journey, a trajectory of how my personal experience has evolved through Interact, where there was already a member partner. Interact was a EU-funded project that could include different sectors, from academics to NGOs to commercial partners. And the very purpose of the collaboration was to have secondments. So work with each other, colleagues in each other's offices, see different practices of work. And Translators Without Borders, an NGO working in the multilingual communication crisis settings, was one of the partners. As the project Interact evolved, what we were doing was interesting then for New Zealand Red Cross, part of the International Federation of the Societies of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And through the work with Interact, we then came out with a number of policy recommendations. So these initial partnerships opportunities, the four bubbles in this slide, then led me to work in different areas. One of which, thanks to the policies, is the work that I am continuing to do with our main research partner, YMCA Sierra Leone, in Sierra Leone, that then led also to a series of other opportunities to conduct funded research, and one of which is this DRIVE project. So I will describe more than anything else how, in a way, I found myself in a number of fortunate circumstances, and being part of Interact was an incredibly important one. So I cannot claim in any way that I started this particular research journey with a structured idea that I'm going to conduct research in partnership with NGOs. It happened, as we say, organically. Initially, there were a set of coincidences that worked in my favor. But then I have to say that, using a Latin philosopher that comes from the same area of Italy where I come from, everybody is a little bit masters of their own destiny. And in that case, I learned that this kind of research was so rewarding that when there were other possibilities of conducting research in partnerships with NGOs, I made sure that I was there ready to listen to what opportunities were around, and in particular listen to research questions that mattered for what then became the research partners. So what questions mattered for the researchers and the colleagues, the managers that worked in those NGOs. So my example has to start with Interact, because it gives you a little bit of the sense of how my current research continues to be in the area of multilingual communication in a crisis setting. And within Interact, the project itself was structured around a sort of balance of 3 academic partners, 2 commercial partners, and 2 strong NGOs involved. And what we were investigating was the role of translation, but then immediately we realized that translation wasn't just the only multilingual tool, but also interpreting and many other intermediate ways of enabling communication related to healthcare principally, but then in general related towards preventing risks to personal health, risks to the family. And Interact then, together with the partners, was shaped around the idea of researching an area of health-related context in translation in crisis that happen in multilingual settings through the lenses of a number of disciplines. So we were looking at what happens in disaster risk reduction in the literature, from both human geography to more strictly speaking disasterology. What is happening in terms of communication studies from the area of risk communication, that is more closely connected with the healthcare, multilingual healthcare communication, and crisis communication. So how do you create effective procedures for communicating in crisis? And of course, my background is in translation, our own disciplines. And you find that this crisis translation is not a new field by any shape or in any form or any intention. We didn't want to invent a new research field. It's rather an idea, a conceptual idea of how we investigate phenomena that happens in during a disaster as a response to an emergency or in long-term humanitarian crisis. And what emerged through this research was the fact that listening matters. And I'm smiling when I'm saying this because, of course, the work that Angela Crack and Hilary Footitt and Vinita Ser were doing also around the project Listening Zones, which was at one point we were overlapping Interact and the Listening Zones, is about listening to people. And in listening to people also meant, in terms of our research approach, to conduct a series of interviews with members of international humanitarian organizations, or generally speaking, different entities that work in the international humanitarian sector, and see how they felt about the issue of language, communicating efficiently with local populations when they don't speak one of the many lingua francas of the either humanitarian team or the NGOs involved locally or the NGOs involved in sustainable development, etc. And what emerged through the discussions was a very strong sense that communication is also to listen to people's concern, as this quote on screen shows, is to address their concerns, to know what they're thinking about. And it goes back to what we were interested in. So it is important for us to speak the same language. Now, I like to use this both in the very strict literal sense of being able to share one language, either through the use of translation or interpreting, or actually figuratively speaking the same language, pursuing the same objectives, not necessarily for the same reasons. The agenda doesn't need to be entirely standardized and harmonized and pre-agreed, but the idea of pursuing the same objectives means also speaking the same language and conducting a research that is truly collaborative. And just as is important in the humanitarian response, I felt that this quote is also a sort of a meta-narrative of what happened to us as a collaborative research group. We found that the more you identified research questions that were missing from the specialized literature in our fields, but they were very present in the everyday experience and phenomena that organizations and our colleagues in NGOs were experiencing, the better the research questions, the better the research drive towards answers to those questions. And that's really what happened through Interact. We had not planned to conduct any specific training at the very beginning of that research network. If some of you have had the chance to read my impact case on training citizen translators or community translators, crisis translators, as we agreed on eventually, happened just by coincidence. When I was seconded in New Zealand, we started having conversations with New Zealand Red Cross, and then eventually Patrick Cadwell and myself started delivering some specific training to a number of community liaison officers, they were called. So these are members of multilingual communities in New Zealand that are part of the Red Cross, and they work in support of the multilingual communities. And one of the support that New Zealand Red Cross was providing at the time, this was 2017, then 2019 and 2020, was support with risk preparedness. So initially was about translating a number of leaflets on how to have your house prepared to evacuate or respond to a particular natural hazards, such as an earthquake, a tsunami. And that involved translating into 13 languages, some of which did not have any professional translator available working commercially in New Zealand, some of which had to be translated with a specific dialect for the communities that were being reached by this information, because the idea was that this particular leaflet, that is an introduction to how to support your family in case of an emergency, had to have some buy-in from the communities. So the notion was, yes, let's involve professional translators as far as possible, but also let's involve our community officers, and where those have never translated before, let's offer them some training so that translation is understood, but at the same time, the needs, the cultural needs and the linguistic specificity of their communities are also presented in the translation. And that for me was incredibly empowering. I had to, together with Pat, we delivered some essential training on translation, which is what I normally do in academia, but it had to happen in 90 minutes. It had to happen with the idea that it could be replicated and reproduced by a New Zealand Red Cross officer. And the idea was, let's develop a multilingual and multicultural understanding of the risks that you face if you live in New Zealand. And so the New Zealand training was focused on local preparedness. So it had to have that element of general training on translation issues, but also a recognition that the language to be used had to apply not just to any Arabic speaker, but to speakers of Arabic living in New Zealand. And so we developed some training resources. Initially, we delivered them in New Zealand, but then we tried to make them non-language specific and usable somewhere else. Those resources reflect two principles. One, they are ideally a first port of call if you really don't have any translator or interpreter available, on how to support bilingual individuals that may need to help you with some translation and interpreting. They're not recommended as the long-term solutions, and we are very keen and aware of saying, if you have any professionals available, go there. But at the same time, they take into account the fact that sometimes commercially, some languages are not viable. Some language combinations are not going to be used. So it's going to be very difficult to find professionally trained translators and interpreters. So the training moved from the initial delivery, which was very highly contextualized in New Zealand, to a more ambitious idea that it could support bilingual individuals who were going to work in different conditions. This came alongside one of the other outputs of Interact, which was a series of policy recommendations around how to go about efficient multilingual communication in crisis. And I'm sharing with you these slides just to give you a sense that we put forward 10 recommendations. I might sound cynical, but even though we put a lot of effort on these recommendations for improving policies on crisis communication, we also took the cynical view that if language continues to be perceived just as a barrier, the impact of these policies would be potentially limited. Anyway, these policies became available on Prevention Web, which is a website widely used by the humanitarian sector. I think they've been downloaded possibly 25,000 times, which is very interesting. But suddenly, when Interact was finishing in March 2020, we started having people reaching out to the Interact research team. So the first one was in January 4 years ago. A guy from Wuhan and said, we have some local epidemic going on and we'd like to produce information not just in Chinese but also in English, and how should we go about it? And we provided sort of recommendations that emerged from Interact. Of course, that wasn't an epidemic and it was more of a pandemic, but the policies had in the meantime been read also by a number of crisis and risk managers in Sierra Leone, who wanted to make sure that what had happened in terms of crisis communication locally during the Ebola crisis wasn't going to be repeated during the pandemic. And so suddenly the policies that I didn't expect to have any impact and the crisis translator training that we were hoping would have any impact were put to the test. And I had Jonas Kraner-House and Pius Mana, that at the time they both worked for YMCA Sierra Leone, who were very much working towards training a number of bilinguals working in the local languages Kono, Creole, Limba, Mende, and Temne. Creole is a form of Creole from English, but it's substantially different from English. And they wanted to make sure that if the pandemic continued to be as quickly moving as it was in the early 2020, that Sierra Leone would be ready with information in a multilingual format. So they contacted me, and we started a collaboration that was entirely based initially on creating those resources that weren't available. So the training for translators from English into those languages, and the training for translation of specific terminology. And the idea of this project, as the title says, was community preparedness through linguistic equality. The driver was entirely from YMCA Sierra Leone. They dictated the aims of the project. And I mean, working with Pius has been one of the best experiences in my life. He's an incredibly driven researcher. Well, he's not even a researcher. He's becoming a researcher by need. He's a risk and disaster manager with a background in international relations and humanitarian and sustainable development. But his understanding of the needs of Sierra Leone, of the multilingual communities, is phenomenal. And he has an incredible drive towards educating the next generation so that what has happened in the past doesn't necessarily happen again. And this part of my collaboration started literally with an email. We need some training, but then it developed into something more. And they said, well, actually, rather than make it all about COVID, which in the meantime had become less of a concern in some areas of Sierra Leone, they said, let's make it about something bigger. Let's make it about risk preparedness in general, so that we are that the need for preparing our multilingual communities are reflected in the resources that we are creating. And so the idea was very much from the very beginning to create multilingual resources that are usable by disaster managers operating among the different multilingual communities in YMCA. The first project then started simply with, okay, let's deliver the Interact training, and then developed into a multi-phase project that is still ongoing. And it started from responding to a real need, which we can see from an early report in 2019 from the World Health Organization, showed how during the Ebola crisis, a lot of the mortality was also linked with lack of cultural understanding, lack of linguistic understanding, and lack of resources to bridge language and linguistic and cultural differences. And because YMCA Sierra Leone had been heavily involved in communicating risks across the country, they didn't want that to be a repeated experience. So we find in 2017, the World Health Organization produced this particular leaflet, which is communicating risk in public health emergencies. These were the guidelines that were in place up to 2019. They've been revised. And now, for those of you who are interested, you can see the centrality of translating in a language and in a format that the people receiving health information can understand. So this had become central concerns before the pandemic. And in fairness, some of the guidelines about responding to the pandemics already in 2004 mentioned being prepared to communicating about pandemics in multilingual formats. But for Sierra Leone, this was not a question of guidelines or not. This was a question of we need more. We don't have bilingual dictionaries. We don't have online dictionaries. Let's create something. And that something was initially the disaster risk reduction terminology. This is a document produced by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's been translated in 7 languages, but it's you have the automatic copyright to translate it in any language of the world from the United Nations. Once we secured the fact that it could be translated, we started translating it. But that wasn't enough, because not only low literacy level, but also the fact that some of these languages are spoken merely orally and primarily orally, it meant that we needed to have something more. So in 2022, we continued by creating a terminology that could be used as a mobile phone app, online and offline. And then now, what we're starting from this month and going forward for the next 2 years is also creating a guidebook on disaster resilience in Sierra Leone, in 5 languages, 6 languages, that will encourage students in secondary education, but also people with primary level or secondary level reading skills in one of the Sierra Leonean languages to access information about reducing local risks. Now, this project for me was an eye-opener in terms of how some of the research, the hard research that we conducted with Interact, immediately applied to the context of Sierra Leone. And we had to work with the principle that resources to produce results were not immediately available. So we couldn't translate the terminology because we didn't have the translators. We had 4 translators and 5 languages. That tells you already where we started. So the training had to create a buy-in from a number of linguists, either lecturers or students of language experts, but also members of the official national the Office for National Security, a number of bilinguals who knew the regions and were operating as risk reduction managers. And it created a sort of pool of resources that then have been used already in 2022 and in 2023 for other multilingual communication contexts. And eventually has led also to the creation of the first National Association of Professional Translators and Interpreters. But from the point of view of what we're discussing today, one of the biggest learning points for me was that this project didn't have any funding. I had just come out of a project that was well funded by the European Union, and I was entering into a very ambitious project with no funding at all. And it started with the little logo that you see up on the left of my slides, the Grand Challenges Fund. This is an internal seed-corn fund within my institution, University College London. And they gave me £4,000. And so I could do the training. Then, because I had £4,000, Pius could go to the United Nations Development Programme and say, we're training young Sierra Leoneans to do this. Can you give us another £4,000? And then eventually this project overall had a budget of £100,000. But that budget was driven by research questions and at the same time application of existing research in a way that made sense to the local funding bodies, the local donors and funders. We didn't have research funds as such. And it made sense because it had a very tangible outcome. And that outcome has been recognized by the National Disaster Management Agency, that continue to be a partner of YMCA Sierra Leone. And next year, we hope to have also the Ministry of Education in partnership with this project to create a continuation of a project that is based on multilingual education. It starts with prevention against risk and the increase of risk because of climate change, but it continues with the general idea that it's important to have access to education in an equal way for all the speakers of different local languages. And the creation of a guidebook that will be in local languages as well creates that expectation that education doesn't need to be only in English as it's currently. Because of what I'd learned there, and I'm going to finish up in the next 3 minutes, Hilary, if that's okay with timing. Because of what I've learned at this point, I felt probably madly too confident to apply to a British Academy grant. And that was by far the most stressful 6 months of my life, but also incredibly rewarding. So together with Andrea of the University of Galway, we had been looking at how multilingual communication may or may not reduce exposure to risk. And then this British Academy scheme came out that was looking at how we could build a better understanding of techniques, processes, mechanism to have cultural and linguistically appropriate responses to the pandemic. So essentially, it was a big learning moment. And the British Academy COVID-19 recovery scheme was about building future pandemic preparedness. So on my side, I had been working on risk communication and preparedness for a number of years, and Andrea had been working quite a lot with Italian NGOs in migrant context in Italy. And what we wanted to see was, can we compare what we'd seen happening in Sierra Leone with a very specific multilingual context and in of course, a low-income country, with what's happening during COVID-19 in highly multilingual and multicultural regions of Italy. And so that's where we conducted a study on vaccination hesitancy and risk communication among multilingual communities of migrants in Italy, in particularly focusing on the capital, Rome, and Emilia-Romagna, because these two areas of Italy have got 20% of the multilingual and multicultural communities in Italy. And what we came about was a number of outputs that could be used immediately by local healthcare professionals, as well as a set of reflections that could help us enhance learning about communication strategies that reached a large population. So we worked with William Lowe, who is currently one of the members of the Save the Children NGO, who's an expert, as a data analyst, is an expert on mapping all sorts of things. For us, it was language mapping, creating a resource where you can understand what sort of languages are spoken in a specific region, and that particular map can be updated live with good quality data by people that have access to census, have access to recent information. And by recent, I mean stuff from 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, can go immediately live. We created this resource, and again, this partnership shifted towards other entities. We collaborated with an independent research group, that is the Centro Studi e Ricerche Immigrazione Statistico. IDOS is a specialist independent research team that does statistical analysis of migrant context in Italy. And what was rewarding from my point of view as a researcher was that we produced two policy briefs. One that was in collaboration with colleagues in 3 other projects within the British Academy scheme. There was a policy brief for the UK. And then also, I was invited to the Ministry of Health in Italy to assess independently the approach to communicating to multilingual communities adopted by 7 regional healthcare authorities in Italy. And what was very interesting there was to identify the best practices on communication that corresponded very much with those 10 policies that corresponded very much with those 10 recommendations to policymakers that we'd made with Interact in September 2019, and that colleagues in Italy had applied during the response in 2020, which to me was incredible that I could have such a tangible return on our outputs. Where I am now, I continue to be interested in international crisis communication in healthcare. And through these experiences, I am continuing to work with an Italian local healthcare body. We start this year as a Center for Translation Studies in my university, a collaboration with NGOs and oncologists in the UK. And we now have a collaboration with YMCA Sierra Leone that is going into its 5th year. We got plans up to 2025 and going forward. What's next? Certainly, I'll continue to work with NGO partners. I'll continue to work with partners because this is incredibly rewarding. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That was really interesting. I think this idea of unpredictability, one thing leads to another, and listening is really very interesting. I'd like to bring in colleagues whom I know have also worked with NGOs. Angela Crack, would you like to come in here and give us something of your experience?
Yeah, thank you, Hilary, and thank you so much for that presentation. It was really, really stimulating and exciting. I want to swap my life with yours, please. if that's okay. Maybe we can sort that out after the presentation. So just a quick introduction to my background. I am an NGO person. I suppose I could put that label on myself. I've been involved with volunteering or working with NGOs ever since I was a student, right since my 20s, which is obviously only a few years ago. And then when I entered academia, I focused on NGO accountability, but I struck up a very productive research relationship with Hilary and also Federico, who's here in the audience today, and we led this project called the Listening Zones of NGOs, and it helped to meld together my expertise in NGO accountability and Vina and Hilary's expertise in language and translation. And the research question was, in which ways does language and translation shape the relationships that development NGOs have with local communities on the ground in the different countries within which they work? It was a 3-year project, and long story short, we found that language and translation is a very low profile in the development NGO sector, and we found that language policies don't often tend to be in place. At the end of that project, we were approached, myself and Vina were approached by Tearfund, and I see Helen from Tearfund is going to speak in the next session. We were approached by them for a consultancy. They were involved with the Listening Zones project from the start, and they were interested in revising their own language policy. So we were consultants for a while. We gave them some recommendations for revisions, which they incorporated, and they launched their policy with great success recently. And so the projects ended up having a lot of impact. Since the end of that project, I've also started a new AHRC funded project, and what that has resulted in, I was working with community-based organisations and NGOs in Malawi, and through a method of participatory translation, we've co-produced a translation glossary into Chichewa and English of development terminology. So that's a very quick introduction to the work I've been doing that involves languages and NGOs, and as a result of that, I want to give you some very quick reflections on lessons that I've learned when working with NGOs, and I hope that they will be of some. These are very practical recommendations, and I hope they will be of use to some of you who are thinking of embarking on research relationships with NGOs, or perhaps some of you who are currently in those relationships and sort of struggling with some of the issues that I grappled with. So after this experience that I've had, one tip that I wish that somebody had told me many years ago is to make sure when you're working with an organisation that you don't have just one contact in that organisation. You need to have resilience in your relationships with NGOs. I found it to be the case in the UK and in all the other countries that I've worked with, is that NGOs in general tend to have a very high turnover of staff. They circulate very, very quickly between organisations. So you can have one great contact and everything can be seems to be going fine. And then all of a sudden they move to work for another organisation, and all of that hard work just falls by the wayside. And that's really difficult because unfortunately it's often the case that language and translation issues tend to be marginalised. I'm generalising, but I think that, you know, there's good grounds for saying this. They tend to be marginalised within an organisation. They tend to be an afterthought. So when you're working with an organisation where you're trying to reel them in, you need to target the people who have a particular passion for this subject. And if you're just relying on that one person and they move on, then you can be in a real sticky situation. So ideally, you want to have as many contacts as possible in that organisation, and some high-level commitment would be really great. Another thing that I would advise that you do is, for want of a better word, stalk your contacts. So these people who you're working with, they move on to other organisations, and then they're able to open up a doorway potentially into another NGO. So it would be really worth continuing to keep the relationship warm, seeing where they go. And they often, you'll find that these NGO contacts will really value the relationship with you, because if they are working in a translation department, for example, and they often feel that they're under the cosh in terms of proving their value for money in the organisation, then having the the credibility, I guess, or the leverage that you can provide as an external academic can be really important for them. So maintain the contacts and not just within the organisation, but the people that you have relationships with. It's worth following them around the sector. Another thing that I want to bring up, another tip, and I think that this is particularly important if you're working in low or middle income countries, is that when you're desperate to find NGO partners, if you're not careful, it can be too easy to take people's eagerness to become involved with your project as a solid indication that they have the capacity to be involved. I have worked with NGOs and community-based organisations in Malawi, and I keep very much at the forefront of my mind that when I say to them, would you like to be involved in this? They are not in a situation where they're empowered enough, where they're able to say no. And so everything that Andrea and Maggy were saying at the start about the importance of inclusive and equitable relationships, totally agree with all of that. And you can, and all the tips that you've provided us about how you try to ensure that inclusivity, I agree with, and I try to operationalize that. But at the end of the day, you can't get away from the structural reality that these are organisations that have to chase every little bit of funding that comes their way. Often the people you're working with, they don't just have their job. Their job isn't just NGO officer, whatever that might be. They can often be farming on the side and doing all types of other things. And you're coming in with money, power, influence, opportunity, and they're not going to say no to you. So I've tried really hard, and I don't know whether I've managed to do this satisfactorily yet, but I tried really hard to create trusting relationships at the start by having very honest conversations, not only at the start, but throughout the project, where I say, I really, really value critical feedback. You know, critical feedback is actually my favorite type of feedback because I don't know it all. I get a lot of stuff wrong. And when somebody tells me that that's a daft decision, perhaps you should think about doing this, perhaps you should think about doing that, perhaps we haven't got the capacity to do this, perhaps we need to look at the timeline or whatever it might be, I really need to hear that feedback. And I appreciate honesty and candidness above all, or candor above all. And I hope that needs to be continually reinforced. And when people do come to me with critical feedback, then I make sure that you've got to receive it. You know, you can't say on the one hand that I appreciate criticism and then sort of bristle when anyone gives it to you. You've got to receive it generously and receive it openly and thank people for that feedback and be responsive to it. So I make sure that I reinforce how much I value it when criticisms are presented to me, but I still don't know whether I'm able to manage these power imbalances satisfactorily, to be honest with you. I don't know how I'm doing for time, so I'm probably overrunning, so I'll just give one more tip, shall I?
Please do. Let's carry on.
Okay, so one more tip is that the impact agenda is I find it really rewarding. I've already written an impact case study and I plan to do so in the next ref. I really like impact because applied research is something that I find very rewarding. However, do be aware that impact can compromise your academic independence, especially when you're working with NGOs, and you can tread a very fine line, because in order to achieve impact, in order to acquire evidence of impact, sometimes you need to become so close to the agenda and the priorities of the organisation that you're working with that if you're not careful, it can kind of undermine your academic integrity. So I find that a difficult balancing act, and I don't think that we often talk about that enough when we're reflecting upon impact. So I just throw that out there, and I'll draw it to a close. Thank you, Hilary.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points. Rosaleen, I wonder if I could bring you in now. Rosaleen Howard, who's worked with perhaps some different sorts of NGOs. Rosaleen?
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Yes, my name is Rosaleen Howard. I'm an emerita professor from Newcastle University. I'm a social linguist and an anthropological linguist. And I've been working starting in 2014 through to 2019, I was involved in two AHRC projects in Peru, working with a Peruvian co-investigator, Luis Andrade, at the Catholic University in Lima, and with Raquel de Pedro Ricoy, who's Professor of Translation Studies at Stirling University. So the two projects, one of them was working with the state organization involved with language rights for indigenous people in Peru. And the second one was working primarily with an NGO who was also very concerned about the linguistic human rights of the indigenous populations in southern Peru that they were working with. So some of the things that you've been talking about in this panel up to now, both Federico and Angela, have really resonated with some of my experiences in Peru. Although I have to say, I think perhaps my experience has been it's been limited in terms of this particular NGO and the project that we conducted. And perhaps as a sort of footnote, I could say we've brought out a lot of publications on the back of this work. So you'd be very welcome if you want to get in touch with me, or I can send a list of those publications through to Hilary. She could circulate it. And I'm going to try and be brief and explain in a bit of a nutshell what this was all about. I think one of the most important points about how we got into all of this was that Peru had passed a very important milestone in its public policy setting or design and legislation. In 2009, there had been very serious confrontation between the rural people up in the northeast of Peru around the city of Bawa, and many people were killed in a sort of crossfire between the country folk, some of whom were indigenous, some of whom were mestizo, and the police. And the government really had to sit up and take notice. At that time, it was a very anti-indigenous government, but they did sit up and take notice. They drafted a legislation to support the language rights of indigenous people. I should also say that in Peru, there are 48 identified indigenous languages, which now all have official status alongside Spanish. And the main one of those indigenous languages is Quechua, which is spoken in the highlands, also a little bit in the Amazon basin. And that's spoken by about, I've got the figure written down somewhere. I should know this sort of thing off by heart. But yeah, according to the 2017 census, 13.6% of Peru's population speak Quechua, and 1.6% speak Aymara, which is the second most important of the highland languages, which is spoken up around Lake Titicaca and the city of Puno. These Quechua and Aymara speaking areas of the highlands have been in the news quite a bit recently because there's now a very different type of government in place, unfortunately, a very reactionary government that has been suppressing in quite violent ways the populations that I'm talking about. The research and impact work that we did predates, obviously, what is happening now. But the very same people we worked with are being thoroughly caught up in what's happening and affected by it. So what was it we did, and where did the NGO come in? We worked on our first AHRC funded project. We looked at the new government legislation to support language rights. And one of the principal actions they took was to train indigenous people to be translators and interpreters between Spanish and their own languages, so that they could then go out and work in public service settings where particularly interpretation. I'm going back to some of what Federico was telling us. Federico used the word translation, and I think on the whole he was talking mainly about production of written material in the different local languages, although of course, as in South America, those local languages are largely coming from an oral tradition. So I think there's quite a bit to talk about I think we do need to make a distinction between translation as in written production and interpretation as in the oral mediation of understanding. So the government trained up many Indigenous people to be interpreters and translators in different settings. It could be in hospital settings or in courts of law. Importantly, in Peru and in other parts of South America, prior consultation between communities and government agents who were trying to negotiate the granting of the concessions for big companies to go in and extract oil and natural gas on indigenous territories. So there are lots of very tricky and contentious scenarios in which really a good understanding of what is going along in both directions is necessary. So that's what the state was taking care of, and that's what we looked at in our first project. But as we went along the way, and this is where my experience really resonates with what you were both talking about, as we went along the way, what was really needed to be done became more apparent, in the sense that what was really needed to be done was seeing what's going on in all those parts of Peru where the state-trained interpreters didn't reach. And we found a whole sort of area of southern Peru where the Aymara and Quechua speakers live, up in the mountains, who were working together with the NGO SER, S-E-R, an acronym that stands for Servicios Educativos Rurales, Rural Education Services. Despite the name, the word education being in there, they were really doing a very broad work in community development and primarily working with female Indigenous leaders, local authorities, women who were being trained by SER, and I think maybe some other collaborators were in there, in leadership skills and citizenship and things that they needed in order to liaise between their communities, where many of the people still don't speak Spanish, or not to a level where they can really understand what's going on in a kind of formal setting, and so liaise between them and the state. So the leaders, these women leaders, are bilingual. They've got, well, we worked in, so the important thing about getting into touch with this NGO was that they were able then to facilitate our getting in touch with the group of women who we put out a call, or the NGO put out a call. They acted very much as the linchpin between us researchers and the women in the communities, put out a call to say who would like to come and work with this group of researchers. And it was in their interest, because the woman who we worked with, Raquel Reynoso, who was the president of SER at the time, she was really clued up about the need to address the linguistic problems. The fact that, just as Angela was saying just now, it's kind of low on the list of priorities to attend to the language issue. It should be quite the reverse. And I'm not just saying that because I'm interested in language. It just seems to me kind of obvious. But unfortunately, perhaps as we all realize, language is sort of an invisible thing that's there, and we take it for granted. And the fact that people aren't really understanding the message or misconstruing the message is not something that we always realize. So the long and the short of it was that with the facilitation of the NGO and very close collaboration with them, and also with the 15 women who volunteered to work with us, 12 Quechua speakers and 3 Aymara, coming largely from the department of Ayacucho in the south, and some of them from Puno up on the lake. We brought them all together and we co-constructed, this is very much part of our proposal, that this is to be a co-constructed project, in order to see how they would like other people to know about what they did as, facilitators of understanding. And I use that term in a very sort of broad sense. The term that Raquel Reynoso, the president of the NGO, used was social translators. She kept telling us, oh, the social translators, they do this, this, and this. So what did she mean by social translators? In the T&I literature, you'll come across the term ad hoc interpreter or natural interpreter. I think those are the two terms that are largely used. So the social translators were doing a very organic, grassroots, contingency oriented. When there's a need, they stepped in and they facilitated the understanding and saved a lot of very tricky situations, and even to the extent of saving lives in some cases. So I don't know how much more time I have. How I might another minute?
Yeah.
I guess just to sum up the pros and the cons of this experience. I mean, we created an impact case study out of the experience, but that was kind of, I'm not so cynical to say that obviously there was some benefit in it for us, but the people who I'm sure most benefited were the women that became involved in the project. And there were two particular outputs, to use that technical phrase. Well, one was that with the women themselves, we created a stage play, and we also had the collaboration of a theatre company based in Lima, a very radical theatre company who quite absolutely got what we wanted. And the women came to Lima and they created a script, and then they actually acted themselves on the stage and like performed I suppose you could say they're like socio-dramas, little sketches that demonstrated how lack of understanding between a doctor and a pregnant woman when she comes to give birth at the hospital can have very, very serious consequences. And there were other scenarios that they demonstrated, and they demonstrated how interpretation works, flipping backwards and forwards between Aymara or Quechua and Spanish. So that was one thing. And we invited the general public to come and see this play on stage. We filmed it, and then we projected the film back in the provinces where everyone could come along and see what their people had been getting up to when they went to Lima. And the other thing that we also did, it was in Lima, but then we found ways of kind of disseminating it, was to set up an audiovisual exhibition in the Lugar de la Memoria, which is the place of memory, or if you like, the Museum of Memory, which would have been established in the wake of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of 2003, when testimonies had been taken from all the people who'd been caught up in the internal war in Peru, pitting Shining Path against the state. And then, of course, there were counterinsurgency troops getting involved in the middle there. And many, many indigenous people lost their lives in that conflict. According to the Commission's report, 75% of the people who died in that conflict were speakers of indigenous languages. So this place of memory that they've now set up in Lima is a place where that conflict is commemorated, on trying to give a representation to both sides, which lots of people think it's a bit controversial, but that's what they do. And then we were granted a space in that museum for the women to have like little video clips and photographs and written testimonies of their lives. It was very beautifully done. We invited the general public. There was press coverage, and there's been all the material that we gathered, the video recordings with the women and their photographs and their written testimony, or their transcribed testimonies, are deposited. They're in the repository at the Museum of Memory. So there were lots of very concrete outputs that people can now refer to. And we had very good feedback from the women. I mean, it wasn't an easy process for them. Some of them actually had living memory of having been caught up in the Shining Path conflict, and they had actually acted as interpreters between Shining Path terrorists and their communities, trying to, avoid the worst thing happening. And then there have been other very serious infringements of human rights in Peru for various different reasons in the last sort of 20 to 30 years, which these women have been involved in trying to mediate. So that's it. And I could also say, relative to the issue about funding, and going back to what Maggy was talking about at the beginning, it was very timely for us to get involved with this, because just at that time in 2014, the AHRC was putting out a call for people to come forward with projects designed to respond to the GCRF remit. And so, because they actually had a sort of envelope of funding, the AHRC did. And it wasn't something usual for them, for arts and humanities, to actually fund projects that fitted under the GCRF remit. And so we managed to create, obviously design something that fitted perfectly. And we got the funding through the AHRC's Translating Cultures theme, led by Charles Footitt, that you may well have heard of. So it was very, very timely in that respect, and also timely in respect of what was happening in Peru with the new legislation coming out. So, that kind of serendipity is very important. And it led us to get to know the NGO. And because we started off thinking, we're going to work with the government here. But then afterwards we realized, let's get in, let's work with the NGO. That really gets us down to the grassroots and down to the nitty gritty of where the real needs are, I would say. Thank you.
I can be heard. Can I be heard now? Yes. I really fantastic presentations, actually, from all three speakers. And I think this idea of serendipity, but the importance of embedding languages in ongoing agendas, which is what really the three of you have talked about, is something that I very strongly identify with in my own work. I mean, I started off working with development NGOs, and I went and said, well, I suppose languages are very important to you. And they said, no, not really, not at all. And I thought, dear, this is difficult. But then I started listening to, which is what Federico was talking about, listening to them. And they were actually saying that they were themselves very worried about feedback. They were worried about monitoring and evaluation. They were worried about their clients actually understanding what they were saying and identifying with it. And if you start talking about that, the way that they are listening, then I think you're not adopting their agenda, but you're adapting their agenda. And that's what I felt, in a way, I was learning to do. And I rather wish that I'd read Maggy and Andrea before I started on this project, to be really honest. There's this idea of speaking the language of others and embedding into their agendas and not into yours. I mean, it should be something that as linguists we're quite good at, really, speaking other people's languages, but it's a question of listening to them, as Federico was saying very clearly, and as Rosaleen demonstrates. A couple of things that I found slightly more difficult. I mean, I think Angela talked about establishing relationships and then people move on because it's a very volatile sector, I think, for good and bad reasons. I found that there was also the problem of temporal differences, really, that NGOs had views on deadlines which were maybe not quite the same as the deadlines that I was working to as an academic. And I think one has to be, first of all, as Angela was suggesting, sensitive to this and upfront it, really, I think, very clearly. The other thing that I learned, it just shows how naive I was when I went into this, was the importance of ensuring that your partners understand the kind of ethical monitoring procedures that you might have gone through in your own university. I mean, we in the project that Vina and Angela worked on with me, we interviewed a very large number of NGO workers, and at one point, one of the NGOs with whom we'd partnered, whose workers we were interviewing, said to us, well, can you give us the transcripts of those interviews, please? And we said, well, no, because we've gone through this ethical monitoring and it's quite impossible to do that. These are anonymized. And I thought afterwards, well, this is really something that should is such an unhelpful word, but I should perhaps have made much clearer right at the beginning. And I think there's this whole question, Angela's point about really upfronting some rather difficult conversations, perhaps much earlier than I did. But I mean, I have to say, we've talked about some of the challenges, but also I think what's come out of all the presentations is the extraordinary opportunities that this represents. Anyway, that's all I've got to say at the moment. I don't know
You're muted, Hilary.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have any questions that people want to raise or points they want to make? Perhaps what we could do is draw some of this together towards the end when we're thinking about next steps. But maybe at this time, I could just begin to draw in our NGO colleagues who have very kindly agreed to talk today. The third issue that we're trying to look at is, what do NGOs themselves think about languages? And I think that we're fortunate, I think, today to get two NGOs, the translation team from Tearfund and Laura de Oliveira from Save the Children, to talk to us about what they think NGOs feel about languages, and in particular, I think, what they feel researchers and academics could help them to do. So maybe I could give the floor, if I could, to the translation Tearfund team, which is Carolina Cusax Cardenas, Alexia Hayward, and Colleen de Oliveira Fernandez.
Thank you, Hilary, very much, and thank you everyone who has spoken before us. I am Carolina. I am the translation manager at Tearfund, and this presentation that we're going to share with you in the next half an hour has been put together by the whole team, even though not all of the team is going to speak to you this afternoon. So let me say, we're going to talk Tearfund. At the end of the presentation, I will put a link on the chat with our corporate video if you want to know more about who we are and what we do. But let me just start by saying we are part, as a translation team, we're part of the communication for development team at Tearfund. Very briefly, communication for development is a social process that involves the use of communication tools, strategies, and methodologies to facilitate positive and sustainable social change. So the main goal of communication for development as a social process is to empower individuals and communities to participate in decision-making processes, advocate for their needs, and bring about positive transformation. And this is very at the heart of what we do as a team. So in terms of what we do in the language and translation team, we work to create system processes and tools that could allow communities to both access, but also share relevant and localized knowledges and practices. And in this way, we hope communities can continue to transform their own realities, affirming and developing skills that can make a dramatic impact on their lives. And I just want to highlight two of the main tools that we use to do that. The first one is our Tearfund Learn website, which contains the majority of our resources. Is a multilingual website translated into what we call our global and regional languages, or some of our regional languages. So it's in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And I would say the majority of what we have ever produced in Tearfund is uploaded there. And the second one is our Tearfund community online learning platform, and also multilingual and accessible to anyone with an internet or a mobile connection. And here we host a range of e-learning courses, but we also host a very interesting place of dialogue, which is our communities of practice, which are very much alive, and a place where knowledge is shared and knowledge is produced by the communities themselves. So one of the questions we want to address with this is, why does Tearfund believe in investing in high quality language services? And I'm going to give you the answer, but I'm going to tell you it's not an answer that we arrived to from the beginning. So after this, I'm going to share with you a bit of the journey of how do we arrive to this. So the answer is that we believe it is essential, one, for governance, and two, for an effective, inclusive communication. And at the center of what we think is good development is the effective, inclusive communication. So for nearly 40 years at Tearfund, we have prioritized translation, or at least started to prioritize translation, to ensure as wide an access as possible for those who would most benefit from the sharing of learning and knowledge, as well as supporting strong governance. Because for us as NGOs, we have those things in balance, isn't it? This ensured that every member of both our internal and our external audiences has exactly the same level of access to high quality documents. And this credibility for us is vital to ensure information and shared knowledge is trusted and remains relevant. We in the team ensure that every word included in a resource available on either the websites I have shared with you, as well as within our corporate policies and processes have been checked at least once by a native speaker who has the knowledge to ensure it's good enough to be used. We have found that pursuing a professional quality translation also drives the organization to continue to consider accessibility. And I think this is something we have particularly discovered in the last few years. So as the translation services, we advocate to consider who needs to access what information and to carefully have the audience at the center of everything that we do. This keeps everyone more mindful of those they are seeking to serve and ensure that their communication needs are met. Not the communication needs of the people creating the resources, but the communication needs of the people accessing the resources. So as I said, this is where we probably are now, but that doesn't mean we started that before, from the beginning. So I'm going to share very briefly a bit of a timeline of how we arrived here. The seeds of a current day language and translation team were planted in the 80s when a Tearfund overseas worker called Isabel Carter developed a strong relationship with and an understanding of what would become a key Tearfund audience. And this is our Footsteps readers. So Footsteps is a magazine that covers a diverse range of topics and is published 3 times a year in English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. It features practical ideas across a range of topics and seeks to inspire and equip people to work with their local communities in new and sustainable ways. It's available free of charge in both print and digital formats. And I must say that the content of the magazine is collected across the globe from practitioners, first-hand practitioners. No, this is not only from experts. This is really a dialogue between people on the ground who are doing things every day. Now, Isabel Carter worked with communities in Kenya, and she knew that resources which had simple and easy to translate language would maximize the chance of life-changing information reaching those who needed it most. And I think that has already been said in some of the presentations earlier. What happened next was that she realized that it was not only the needed to be expanded. So she set about to seek to start translation of Footsteps into French in order to reach Francophone Africa. Pioneering, but knowing little about formal translation processes, she was determined to find a way, and she sought the help of a French lady in her village and the help of Helen Machin, who is still part of our team, to make this possible. So in 1990, we have the first French version of our Footsteps, which you can see on the screen. Now, soon after, obviously, it was not only Francophone Africa that needed to be reached, but she also found that we needed to reach other audiences, mainly in Spanish and Portuguese. So she continued the same process, reaching out to volunteering translators or people who were bilingual, but probably not professional translators. So even though the process was not yet perfect, we were starting to include languages in what we did. In the 2000s, hot on the heels of Footsteps came 2 further resources. You'll see on the screen the Pillars book and the Roots guides. Our Pillars was a practical discussion-based learning on issues related to grassroots development for small groups. It wasn't think, but we were ahead of time in this in such a way that it could be accessed even in very low literacy environments, as well as easily translated into any local language and easily reproduced. That was key characteristic of the Pillars book. So on the other side, we have the Roots guides, which are more strategic level topics. And these were written collaboratively, pooling knowledge and experience from Tearfund staff and partners around the world in order to best meet the needs of this more specific audience. And we were talking about things like resource management, human resources, peace building, governance, etc. Then centralize the translation services. Until then, different Tearfund teams were sending small translation jobs to their own informal contacts. So there was no consistency, there was no quality control. So whilst they're working with some existing informal translators, we started to work with a handful of professional freelancers. Although not paying particularly high rates, we still somewhat naive of what professional translation really cost and really involved. So at this point, the vast majority of our translations were into English, and they were more funding based. So they were translating funding proposals written in a country into English for funders in the UK. This changed very quickly. And then in 2008, Tearfund itself started a decentralized decision-making process. We wanted to have decision-making closer to the people, so we strengthened our regional offices. And then we have a growing demand to start translating policies, safeguarding governance-related documents into what at the time were called our core languages, which French, Portuguese, and Spanish. We then proceeded in 2012. We, as a team, we have a focus of increasing the quality of more complex publications. We started to really start going to translate big guides like the ones I showed before. We really felt the need to be more professional in our translation processes, and this is a simple example of how we work now. We work with professional freelance translators and proofreaders, and we began to see qualified translators, both from the Chartered Institute of Linguists as well as the Institute for Translation and Interpreting, particularly looking for those who have experience in translating working for other NGOs. So where we are now is last year we have a team of 5 professionals. We, myself, I have an editor per language. We have a French editor, a Spanish editor, Portuguese editor, and an Arabic editor. And with this capacity, we have been able to translate close to 1 million words in the last year, the majority from English into what we call our global and regional languages. Just briefly to tell you the reach of our languages, and where we are now. So in terms of technology, we have adopted MemoQ as our translation software to build our translation memory for consistency and cost savings. We're also beginning to combine with some machine translation, and with the advent of artificial intelligence, we continue to develop and are now actively engaging in emerging technology that would allow us to access and benefit for what AI can bring. In terms of the reach, as I said, of our audiences in terms of languages, Tearfund Learn website, as you will see, have almost 680,000 people accessing it in the last year. 41% of them did it in Spanish, then 23% in English, 22% Portuguese, and 12% in French. And just briefly, I want to share with you the progression that we have seen in terms of language. So we have seen a constant growth since 2019 of total visitors to our website, but the growth has been mainly in other languages than English. So when we started with the new analytics system of Google, in 2019, 58% of people access our website in a language different from English. Last year, that number was 73%. So we went from 38% in 2019 to 73% of people accessing our languages. Our website saw that in other languages than English. And briefly to talk about our local languages, I mean, we have started to be more intentional and support local languages. Incredibly interesting to hear from what I will share today about social translations and crisis and translation. We have just started to look more intentionally to that. We have recently started to support local translation into Urdu, Burmese, and Nepali. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I'm going to bring my colleague, Alexia, who used to be my manager. And the reason she is very much here today is because she led the process of our translation language and translation policy, which very much involve working very close with 2 academics which are present here today. So the way we're going to do this is in interview format. So I'm going to ask Alexia a few questions and she's going to answer them. So let's hope this works. Alexia, are you on mute?
I'm unmuted, I think. Can you hear me?
Brilliant. Yes, nice and bright. So would you mind introducing yourself?
Yes, thank you. Good to be here. I'm Alexia Haywood, and as Carolina said, I used to be the translation manager in Tearfund between 2019 and 2022, and now working freelance. But during the course of our conversation, I'll probably say we are us, and I'll be referring to Tearfund because old habits die hard. So
very much, you're definitely part of us. So I wonder if you can share with us, how has Tearfund's translation team collaborated with academics?
Yeah, so I think for those who've been participating since the beginning, these names will be familiar, but there have been three main interconnected events. We participated in interviews and discussions before my time for the research project, the listening zones of NGOs, led by the universities of Reading and Portsmouth and Intrac. Then I participated in Dr. Veena Tisser's research Translation as Empowerment, following that. And finally, as Angela mentioned earlier, we engaged Drs. Angela Crack and Veena Tisser in research to update Tearfund's language and translation policy in 2021.
Brilliant. And why has Tearfund's translation team collaborated with academics?
Well, I would highlight three main reasons. One was that we saw it as an opportunity to learn from and incorporate best practice from research across the wider sector that academic research could offer us, and across the wider sector and from different countries. And for that, as has been mentioned previously by some other participants, it was important that the research produce practical recommendations that we could take on board. Then we also saw the invitation to participate in research as an opportunity to highlight, share, promote our own best practices as an organisation, particularly for Tearfund, having what you've described as quite a long trajectory with translation and language. We wanted to sort of show what we did well as well. And finally, for more specific purposes, the one that Angela mentioned, to benefit from the expertise of specialist academics in research specific to our organisation, to help build convincing cases for policy changes. And Angela mentioned credibility, and I think that's what we saw an opportunity there to work with academics to build a credible case internally for changes that we wanted to make and to show the importance of language and translation in our organisation.
Thank you. Can you tell us a bit more of what was involved in the language and translation policy update?
Yeah, so in 2019 was when the position of translation manager, which I started in, was created in Tearfund. And at that point, our translation team had grown to 3 people. So we had 2 translations editors and me as translation manager. And we were focused still mainly on what we called at that time our core languages of English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. And at that point, it was already clear that we needed to update our translation policy, which was only last formally updated about 8 years before that. So practice was really outrunning policy. There was a rising demand for translation in general, but also in languages outside our core language combinations. At the same time, there was a growing emphasis on diversity and inclusion, or D&I, within and outside Tearfund. And within Tearfund's own D&I work, there was mention of language, but the central role of translation and interpreting wasn't explicitly linked to it. And neither was the organisation's long-standing work in translation. It just didn't have internal visibility. However, externally, it did have visibility thanks to the listening zones and translation as an empowerment, and Tearfund had been mentioned as a leading example among NGOs in its inclusiveness through language. So yeah, the research helped, it also helped reinforce what we knew we were doing well and what we could improve. So in terms of improvement, this included broadening the scope of the organisation's languages beyond those associated with colonialism, but also basing the scope on more rigorously understood language needs among Tearfund staff and its programme work. And it was also clear that for the updated language and translation policy, we needed visibility and buy-in across the organisation, and the policy development process itself needed to be inclusive. So we intentionally linked the policy development to Tearfund's D&I work insofar as possible. And we also approached the policy as an organisation-wide policy requiring sponsorship and sign-off of the executive team. Our previous translation policy didn't explicitly have that remit. So at the start of the policy development process, like I said, we engaged Vina and Angela, both of whom had been involved in the listening zones. And they did background research for us, including interviews within Tearfund and with 4 other sector NGOs. And they produced a briefing report highlighting in relevant internal and external trends, practices, and challenges. And they also designed a consultation process that would gather robust information about language and translation needs among Tearfund staff, principally through a language needs survey. So both the background research and the survey were essential in informing our updated language and translation policy, but also, as I mentioned, informing and convincing the organisation, particularly senior management, of the need to engage in the process and really invest in translation. So we followed that research up internally through interviews with representatives from across Tearfund's regions to deepen our understanding of their needs and practices regarding translation. And the process, finalising the policy did take some time for different reasons, but also because of the desire to take an inclusive approach, as well as gain executive team buy-in. And we feel like it paid off in terms of now having a management level policy in our organisation that we can refer all teams to.
Brilliant. And I wonder if you can highlight what were the key differences between the previous policy and the updated policy.
Yeah, sure. So the updated policy has a number of differences. We call it a language and translation policy rather than a translation policy. And the purpose of this was to really position languages higher on the organisation's agenda and highlight how our translation policy and processes originate in what languages we recognise as important and how highly we value effective and inclusive communication in different languages. So this means policy now covers interpreting as well as plain language, mainly plain English communication, because we still produce a lot of resources in English. And so linked to that, the policy explicitly refers to language and translation as a diversity and inclusion issue. It does also recognise sign languages and Braille, even if at the moment there are areas to be further explored. The in-depth research and consultation carried out with the support of academic researchers led to the reconfiguring of Tearfund's organisational languages away from 4 core languages to now what we now call global, regional and local languages, which is based on a better understanding of programme and staff language needs and a desire to de-emphasise these kind of core colonial languages. We also tried to tip the scales away from English dominance in other ways by making plain English, like I said, a more specific requirement in general and for translation purposes particularly. The updated policy outlines more clearly how to consider both inclusion and risk in translation prioritization and quality control processes. And here is where the humanitarian piece referred to a bit previously by Federico comes in. And I think is still to be developed, but when, ranging from sort of crisis situations to more ongoing development work, how do we balance inclusion and risk? Previously, we had more of a gold standard approach to translation quality that many colleagues found prohibitive, and particularly, could be prohibitive in crisis situations. So we also wanted to move away from prioritization being determined by whose budget was bigger and whose voices were louder. So that's one of the areas we wanted to cover in the policy. And as you mentioned, the policy does cover now our aim to integrate technology and AI more intentionally in our work. Yeah.
Thank you. And really interested to know, what has the impact of this work with academics been in your view?
Yeah, so again, I'd highlight 3 areas, and they're ones that have been referred to before, but strengthening the evidence base is really important, and thus Tearfund, in this case, our policy position regarding translation. So the fact that we were positively appreciated by the different research projects mentioned helped us to underline and emphasize the importance of language and translation within our organization. The fact that we could quote from listening zones and translationist empowerment, the Tearfund was an example of good practice, gave us confidence to communicate this within the organization, and also to communicate the language matters to development, and that translation can be empowering and inclusive, in contrast to the view of many colleagues that formal translation processes were expensive, cumbersome, and as such exclusive. But this is still an ongoing struggle. The second area was help in improving Tearfund's practice, so linking with academics who are able to highlight strong points in our practice from evidence across the sector or more widely, and also play the role of critical friends, helped us to see how we could improve, and then this informed our policy. And then thirdly, and more specifically, helping us to develop more robust consultation processes in the way I described with Angela and Vina's support, where they, to an extent, were independent observers who could analyze the results of interviews and surveys and present us with conclusions. I'd finally just make the point that it was really important that the academics, and so far all the academics that we've worked with have been like this, but were personable and understood our sector and the kind of work we did well, and combined that with their skills of critique, or combined the skills of critique with appreciative inquiry. So we're able to build us up as well as, make suggestions for improvements. So,
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Alexia. I will continue with our last part of the presentation. Thank you. So another side of what we do, and it has been mentioned before, is we not only translate, but we also offer interpretation. And I will encourage my colleague Colleen to come and speak about that briefly.
Muted.
Are you muted, Colleen?
So sorry. Yes, I'm Colleen. I'm responsible for dealing with the interpretation requests at Tearfund. So just before the pandemic, we began to have a few interpretation requests, but they were very sporadic. This, of course, changed dramatically in 2020 when, due to the pandemic, there was this boom in online meetings everywhere and also within Tearfund. And we see this as our efforts bearing fruits, because the teams wanted to take advantage of this tool to actually be more inclusive. And there was this increase in demand for interpretation. As a result of that, we started to build our pool of interpreters who work to and fro English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. So these professionals, they have been able to work with us regularly, and we've been able to develop with them a relationship, and they have become familiar with our terms, our theme, style, and language, which has also enabled them to provide more accurate and faithful service. And recently, we have also developed our own internal interpretation guidelines, which we share with teams when they ask for interpretation for the first time. In this document, we explain some of the technicalities of the interpretation and some steps that they need to take before and during the meeting so that the best level of service is provided and we can effectively meet the needs of the people who are using interpretation. And these guidelines have also been shared in Nepal and Pakistan. So we are actively trying to disseminate these good practices as widely as we are able. And the meetings that are interpreted cover a variety of subjects. So from theology forums to staff conferences, which are very internal and corporate types of meetings. And one highlight that I would like to mention is one rubbish campaign that it's organized within Tearfund, and they hold monthly meetings in which they meet to coordinate their activities, like the activists, and they join together to plan for their next action in this month. And there are participants from UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many countries in Latin America as well. And there are also waste pickers and activists who participate. And we have been told that interpretation has been a game changer for them because it has enabled them to work in ways they had never done before. So prior to that, the team in UK would receive case studies afterwards. So this was a very detached information sharing, whereas now they were able to build a relationship and actually work as a team. And there were projects that were built, that were carried out in the UK and in Latin America due to this exchange that they were able to have. So we think this is a beautiful example of what we really aim to achieve with interpretation, which is to enable the building of bridges between people and ultimately cultures so that they can effectively share knowledge and grow together. And of course, as Carolina said, still a work in progress. We're very much learning as we go, but we do have this clear objective in mind, which is to enable as wide an access as possible to the contents of our online meetings and also ensuring participation from all attendees, removing language barriers whenever it's possible. And that's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Caroline, very much. So, well, this is us. As I said, I will put in the chat a link to our video if anyone is interested to know more of what Tearfund does and where we work. But thank you so much for your time, Hilary, and for everyone this afternoon.
Hi. Can I thank Tearfund? That's really interesting and very interesting to hear that some academic research provided evidence and provided a critical friend, but also a supportive friend in the sector. I thought that was really interesting. I'd like to introduce, if I might, our next speaker, who is Laura de Oliveira from Save the Children International. And I'll be very interested to hear what she has to say about languages and about academics working with NGOs. Laura.
Thanks, Hilary. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Hilary. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Laura de Oliveira, and I hold the role of Translations Lead at Save the Children International. And in today's presentation, I aim to share insight into life within an international NGO from my perspective as the lead in the in-house translations unit. The unit was recently transferred from Save UK to SCI, and so is really at the beginning of its journey to understand just how much reach we can get, how we can build the unit up to make as much impact as possible. So it's an exciting time for us. So this presentation is also informed by research done by communications consultant Vina Dessert, who, as we know by now, has been very instrumental in the sector. And I've worked closely with her over the past year to better understand the potential remit of Save the Children's Translations Unit on a business case. And I'm very excited to be releasing a report, an external report, hopefully in the spring. No pressure, Vina, that will document the work that we've done together. So it's an exciting time for us at the moment. So first, I'll talk briefly about my professional background, and I'll share a few words on Save the Children's international work before moving on to language challenges experienced by NGOs by and large. And we'll then look at current priorities, followed by thoughts on approaching translation as a strategic link. And I'll conclude with insight on advocating for translation among NGO senior leadership teams and decision makers before opening the floor to questions. So a little bit about me. I am a French and translation graduate, and I've always worked with languages and translation both as a senior project manager in corporate translation agencies and as a freelance French to English translator and project manager. So I've got experience of both corporate worlds and development worlds too, which I think has been really useful in my role at Save the Children. I joined Save in January 2023, and my role includes leading on translation strategy and operations for the organisation and developing the translations unit from a demand-driven service to a centre for linguistic expertise. And lastly, in cementing Angela's earlier comments, the Listening Zones of NGOs research project really has been instrumental in the direction and strategic decisions that I've made in my role at Save the Children. And the final report of the research project contains conclusions and recommendations made on the role of languages and power relations within development work, organisational awareness, and languages and language policy. And although it was published 6 years ago now, the findings still remain relevant to me and will continue to steer my strategic work. So yeah, I echo the sentiment that it's a really important piece of work for NGOs. Okay, so a little bit about Save the Children. The organisation is the world's first children's rights organisation, founded in the UK by Eglantine Jebb back in 1919. Since then, the charity has evolved into a global membership organisation made up of Save the Children International, also referred to as SCI, and 30 members. The Save the Children movement shares one name, one strategy, and one ambition for all children to survive, learn, and be protected. As of 2022, SCI included 61 country offices, 5 regional hubs, and 2 humanitarian offices, response offices, 17 partner-led programmes, and a global team working for the movement. So for context, the translations unit is based in the global communications team. So we are there to serve the movement. And our core languages are currently English, French, Latin American, Spanish, and Arabic. And as I mentioned earlier, we really are at the beginning of our journey to understand how we can serve the movement. The translations unit is a team of 2 people, me and a translations coordinator. And we are hoping to see the team grow, but obviously it's a big job for a small team. So like working with academics is really instrumental in understanding how we can maximize the resource that we have. Okay, so moving on to some common language challenges in NGOs. Let's look then first at a lack of internal translation expertise. So I think quite a few NGOs lack internal translation expertise in relation to the size and scope of their global activities. For example, in my role, I find that translation is repeatedly viewed as a service rather than a skill, which contributes to a lack of strategic foresight regarding language accessibility across the organisation. On a positive note, though, since being in post, I have received support to address this core issue from colleagues across the organisation, so obviously this is encouraging. Next, and arguably a direct impact of a lack of internal expertise. I think NGOs can struggle to fully recognise the role of languages in their operations and the importance of translation in achieving their core objectives. Another challenge that I've seen is a lack of language data. The translations unit at SCI includes myself and one translations coordinator, as I've mentioned. And we really do struggle to find time to explore how we can manipulate data surrounding the need for and impact of centralized translation strategies. And so as a result, I think we have a hard time really advocating for their worth with senior leadership teams who are obviously instrumental in the resource that we have as a unit. I think defining primary languages for translation is another sticking point for NGOs, many of which are increasingly committed to decolonising their work. So a lack of available language data further hinders decisions on the languages that NGOs consider to be core and the extent to which they look to incorporate local languages in their operations. Next, a lack of funds dedicated to translation activity is another common challenge. The extent of the funding gap could also be linked to a lack of clarity among NGO leaders and decision makers who may be unaware of the full extent to which a solid translation strategy could contribute to achieving their goals. Lastly, keeping ahead of the newest technology in the translation industry can prove extremely tricky for under-resourced and time-poor translation teams. The rapid rise of AI within the translation industry is a perfect example of this. And as an internal translations unit, we must continually seek to understand the benefits and pitfalls of technology in order to best guide our colleagues on their potential use. And obviously, this is no mean feat. It's something that we increasingly are needing to spend time on because colleagues are constantly asking, why can't I just put this in DeepL? And obviously, we all know why. But to actually take the time to explain and to put the guidance out there is another matter. So moving on now to priorities. For Save the Children International and many other NGOs, particularly in the humanitarian sector, ensuring diversity, equity and inclusion in the workplace is a fundamental objective, prioritised right across the organisation. So SCI's three core DEI pillars are to create a working environment that attracts and develops the best talent globally, to build an agile, inclusive and capable organisation that can adapt and deliver in all contexts, and lastly, to foster a culture of pride and performance by creating an organisational culture that embraces diversity and encourages behaviours that are aligned to the organisation's values. A large number of strategies have been implemented across Save the Children to define, lead and embed DEI initiatives throughout the organisation. And the second priority is localisation. And obviously this will come as no surprise to many of you here that it's a key priority for many humanitarian NGOs, and Save the Children is no exception. In 2022, Save the Children signed up to the Pledge for Change initiative, which involves 3 pledges to ensure NGOs establish equitable partnerships, tell authentic stories, and influence wider change in support of local actors. The pledge reflects an acknowledgement of the unequal power dynamics in the development and aid sectors and the need to ensure a fairer future, and particularly the role that international NGOs must play in ensuring global South civil society and communities continue to grow and flourish. Save the Children International's Local to Global for Impact strategy aims to significantly scale down direct programme delivery in favour of supporting local and national actors. By shifting power to children, communities and local partners, SCI seeks to improve its own accountability to children and local actors, support local and child-led organisations to directly access resources, and use its position to elevate the role of local actors. Now, something that I find interesting is that this this strategy was defined before the translations unit moved to SCI, and it's not something that we're actively involved in. So this is really an area for us as a unit to step up in and ensure that our voice as experts in translation and language are going to be heard in the localization agenda going forward, because obviously we know that it's crucial that if you want to shift power, then you need to ensure that language accessibility is there. So that's a big priority for me going forward. So highlights of SCI's localization initiatives include capacity sharing in Syria, which saw a holistic approach to capacity development, where we provided grants to local organizations for capacity strengthening activities. And one organization, Violet, used this grant to build their own fundraising platform, allowing them to raise over $450,000 in unrestricted funds. Meanwhile, in Yemen, we amplified the voices of local and national actors in humanitarian advocacy. SAVE nominated the Tamdeen Youth Foundation, which is a Yemeni organization, to speak on behalf of Yemeni civil society organizations at a meeting with European member state humanitarian attaches ahead of a donor pledging conference on Yemen. And yet, if we are to truly shift power to local and national actors, language accessibility.
Laura, you mute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Was I on mute the whole time?
No, just the last 20 seconds.
Right, okay. Bear with me 2 seconds. Yes, so if we are to truly shift power to local and national actors, then language accessibility is a crucial element of both of these highlights. So to me, I ask questions such as, were the grant applications accepted in Arabic? If so, were they translated for those awarding the grants? Was the translation done impartially, accurately, and faithfully to ensure equity? And to amplify voices in Yemen, were interpreters provided? Were they professional linguists with experience in the sector? Were they briefed timely and adequately? Or were multilingual colleagues asked to interpret instead? So these are just 2 examples of the importance of well-funded, well-planned language accessibility and areas where I think we really need to make sure that language and translation strategies have got a gaining ground, and that the translations unit is getting a seat at the table, and that is a job that we, I still need to do, and I will need support to do that, and be looking at how I can bring in those that academic influence to really push forward the need for representation in these core priorities that are really dependent on adequate language and translation support. So building on this line of thinking, I'd like to position translation as the missing strategic link within DEI and localization strategies in NGOs. As we've seen with Tearfund, they are actively working, that their translations unit is well developed. And I think that's the case for some NGOs, but I don't think it's the case for all. And certainly at Save the Children, we're actively working to make that the case, because historically, as we've heard earlier in the day, language and translation is marginalized, and I do think that is still the case in certain areas. So again, it's we can't rest on our laurels. I certainly can't anyway. So yes, translation is a strategic link in DEI strategies. I think it should play an integral role if we are to truly ensure equal access to opportunities. And language barriers can cause a lack of equity in meetings, for example, impacting directly on whose voice is heard and who's able to successfully contribute to knowledge exchange and decision making. So all too often, bilingual and multilingual colleagues and NGOs are unduly burdened with translation, proofreading, interpreting requests. Especially, they're often called on to proofread translations done externally, and often, by big teams, by big agencies that we haven't had the support to know how best to translate for the NGO. So they haven't maybe had, terminology given to them or managed over time. So that then adds even more to the workload that the multilingual colleagues have to deal with when they're proofreading translations that where the quality just isn't there. They're also often not trained for this or recognized for it. So by integrating awareness of language and translation and DEI strategies, the burden there becomes visible and then can therefore be addressed. Likewise, giving language and translation experts and NGOs a seat at the table in DEI strategic planning efforts then ensures that language challenges experienced by regional offices, for example, where teams are often required to navigate multiple languages, such as in West and Central Africa, and they often bear the brunt of sensitive and urgent translation needs. So it enables these issues to be flagged and addressed. If translation specialists are able to say, have you thought about this? Moving on to localization, I believe integrating translation expertise and provision into localization strategies is crucial to ensure meaningful engagement with local and national actors. The extent to which translation is integrated can also help advance decolonization efforts. If, for example, we invest time and resource in understanding the language needs and preferences of the communities we want to shift power to. Lastly, adequate translation planning is key if we are to facilitate the co-creation of knowledge, such as technical expertise, in a consistent, sustainable, and efficient way. So moving on to advocacy efforts. For language and translation practitioners, integrating translation into organizational planning is a no-brainer, but the value add is a lot less clear, I think, for non-translation specialists, managers and colleagues and NGOs, who all too often see this as a secondary issue, if at all, resolved simply by buying translation services from somewhere at the point of project delivery, once all of the specialists involved in the project have done their bit and have moved on to the next focus point. So we know this is an unwise way of working, but how do we drive home the importance of approaching translation as expertise to be invested in and integrated into strategic planning, as opposed to a service that operates independently in rush conditions and with little budget? So I think we can do this by presenting strong data-driven research to NGO senior leaders and decision makers. So for DEI, this could mean collecting robust and consistent data on the languages spoken by their staff, which would provide a direct link to the way in which language can contribute to exclusion. And for localization, this might mean collecting more reliable data on the language needs and preferences of communities and partners working with NGOs to shift power in a sustainable and sincere way, and looking at potential needs for language mapping, for example. Additionally, methods for measuring the impact of translation efforts are desperately needed if we are to convey the true value out of a well-funded, well-resourced translation team and strategy to NGO leaders and decision makers. Angela, it's interesting to hear your thoughts on working in impact. It's an interesting perspective to hear. So, lastly, I'd like to return to the Listening Zones research project to illustrate the very real ways in which academics can influence NGO strategy over time. I found that the final report was written in plain English, making it accessible to non-academics such as myself and my colleagues who are unfamiliar with the translation sector. It's also data-driven and includes contributions from both NGOs and language practitioners, so it does give it weight when I'm showing it to my managers and leaders in Save the Children, which is really useful. And I believe this multidisciplinary approach to research is a powerful way for academics to support NGOs in a digestible and practical way, and offers a pathway to successfully implementing translation strategy in NGOs. And just as a slight anecdote, I shared the Listening Zones final report with my manager on my first day at Save, and I said, please read this, you need to read this, it's a really great piece of research. My manager said, yeah, I've read it. Lots of people have already sent it to me. So it just goes to show how when a report is written in that way, like it does gain ground, and it does slowly little by little get its way out there. And the fact that it was written in a way that was accessible, like it took into account multiple perspectives. And I think that was really key to its success in a lot of ways. So. Also, I'm not being paid to say this. It is just my truth. It's what I believe. Okay, final thoughts. So I hope today's presentation has given you some insight into the current challenges and priorities within Save the Children and NGOs at large, and some food for thought on the ways that our collective linguistic expertise could be used to help raise awareness among non-translation specialists in NGOs, such as leaders and decision makers, of the importance of integrating language and translation requirements into higher level organizational planning. And additionally, I think by continuing to explore pathways for multidisciplinary collaboration and knowledge sharing I do feel confident that we can slowly but surely influence the perception of language and cultural knowledge. In NGOs, obviously in my case, Save the Children. And so far, leaning into the knowledge of the experts in this room today has provided extremely fruitful and has ensured, most crucially, as I've just mentioned, that the strategic ideas I have shared over the past year in my role have been supported by senior management. So I'm really thankful for that collaboration. And yeah, so that's it. Thank you for listening, and please do feel free to share any questions. And if you'd like to reach out to me, my email is on the screen. You can find me on LinkedIn, and yeah, I'm very keen to carry on conversations with anybody who feels that that would be useful. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much for the Tearfund team as well. I think there are lots of questions, actually, aren't there? I mean, it seems to me that there's an agenda that's being set here, which is about diversity, equity, inclusion, localization, which are things that academic researchers are doing a lot of work on at the moment. I wondered if other people have got questions or points to raise. It is a bit late in the afternoon, I know. Angela.
Thank you. Sorry to barge in. I found those presentations, all of the presentations today, really engaging, and the last two in particular. Thank you for the very kind things that you said about listening zones and so on, but it's given me plenty of food for thought and renewed inspiration and motivation to carry on in this line of work. And so beautifully presented and well organised as well. I wish I could invite you to speak to my students, but I'm not going to, because you'd show me up. But anyway, my question is, so we're all on the same page. We all want to influence policy and practice in a more positive direction. Can you please tell us, the speakers from the last session from Tearfund and Save the Children, how academics are best able to do that? Laura, it sounds as if you found the Listening Zones report really useful. And in Tearfund, it sounds as if the more tailored report that we produced was useful for you. But how do you think that what outputs do you think that we should produce that are liable to reach as many people in the sector as possible and to present a message in the most succinct and effective way? Because finally, I'm really glad that the report was useful for you, but elsewhere we had the sense that for some people it was maybe too much to digest, and we should have experimented with other formats that would be more suitable for people who are time pressed. So do you have any ideas on how we can best enhance our impact?
I'm happy to. Oh, sorry, Caroline. I'm happy to go. I think when I was putting together this presentation, it was one of the key things that hit me was you need to make things, when you're thinking about what's going to be received by senior leaders and managers in NGOs, things need to be snappy and it needs to cut through the noise. And Save is a particularly corporate NGO, I think, and so I definitely have that understanding of how do you present in a way that it's going to actually gain ground and it's not just going to go into somebody's folder that they're not going to see again. So for me, I think it's breaking it down into those real priority issues that are seen as strategic in whatever year we're in. Like right now, we have in Save, we have our very clear strategic goals, and if anything falls outside of that, then it's not really going to get heard. And so at the moment, it's localization and it's DEI. And so I think then can we dig down into that deeper and really pick maybe 2 or 3 core issues that we can then look at within that lens. For example, with localization, could it be language mapping where we really put our focus in, because we know that for localization to really gain ground and to do what it needs to do, it needs to have that language consideration into it. We need to know what language people are speaking. I don't think we have that knowledge at the moment. I think, again, it's that language, or we do that at the end. We think about that at the end. We don't need to think about it at the start. It's fine. We think about localization at the start, and then we think about language. And so I think for me, the way that we integrate it is maybe by sort of serving these practical applications of, well, have you thought about language mapping? It's a thing. We can package it up to you, and we can help you insert it into your strategy. So I think it's finding those real practical applications, but yeah, drilling down into the real valued pieces of work in the organisation, whichever organisation it is. Which again, to find that out, you need to have, like you said, those key contacts that have got the inside scoop. And I've been saying that to Vina in our work on the business case of the translations unit. It works so well because I'm able to provide that insight that she just can't get. And so that real strong collaboration that we have has been really helpful in that respect, to get that inside info. So that's what I would say on that.
Thank you.
Oh, I wonder whether, sorry. So I wonder whether, Federico, you've got any comments on some of these agendas that our colleagues have been talking about?
Everything that was said resonates with me. One of the biggest headache was how to properly package the policy recommendations. So we say 10. If people wants to read the details, there's a 5-page to follow that, but otherwise there's one A4 page, so that can be, could be the highlight. One thing on which we tried to insist both within Interact and then later on the Strive project is a 2-page executive summary, as far as possible translated into the languages of everybody who participated. So in the case of the Strive project that we ran among a number of language communities in Italy, we made sure that the results of our research project was disseminated in 2 pages of A4 in Wolof, Arabic, Chinese, a number of languages of the communities that we interviewed, so that also there is a return of information, because these relationships are also human relationships, and equality also starts there. So if you've given me your time and your availability to work with me and to get us to understand the problems, then I should return at least that. But packaging those 2 essential pieces of information is sometimes difficult, and I like the point about speak to the agendas. So you need to have the right contacts so that you can speak to the right agenda, and that what you're saying about languages can be understood and perceived in the right context. That was really, summarized it. Speak to our agenda as well.
Rosaleen, I think you had something to say as well.
Thank you. I put it in the chat. I wasn't sure there'd be time. No, it just, with the exception of what Federico told us, and to some extent of my own experience in Peru, at the moment, developing a more multilingual framework for NGO work is limited to the languages that were originally the colonizing languages of the countries where the NGOs are working. So, but nonetheless, we heard from Laura the importance of the concept of localization in the new policy agendas that are emerging. But then surely that should include a more, proactive use of local languages in terms of, as part of that localization approach. So I'm just wondering if anyone's got any thoughts about how this could be achieved. I mean, for example, in Peru and Bolivia, they have language training programs for public sector workers who may only be speakers of Spanish, and they according to the reformed constitutions of those countries, they are now obliged to learn the local languages in order to continue in their jobs as public sector workers. So I'm just wondering if any of you got any experience of that kind of thing, or perhaps thoughts on it.
If I could say, if I can speak from a Tearfund perspective, but I totally agree with that. And though our in Tearfund, the updated language and translation policy still maintains the kind of colonizing languages as quite central. There is built into it a kind of aim to gradually kind of broaden that out and recognize other languages and support translation and interpreting into those languages. And as always, we're always limited by funding in terms of how much support we can provide. So I don't know, I agree with what Lara was saying in terms of speaking to the agendas, and to kind of come back to Angela's question on the kind of research. I think more of the kind of research that provides case studies that can be kind of scalable into NGO work would be really useful in terms of localization. So like examples of how within certain contexts or programs, language training can work, and it can be then adopted more widely in an organization, I think would be really useful. So research that kind of can improve a project on the ground. Yeah.
If I could add very briefly to that, I think we as an NGO sector in general are going to feel a pinch in terms of funding coming up. And I think that undoubtedly put pressure of things that particularly the D&I agenda. And I think one opportunity that we have and we necessarily need to explore is the benefits of AI and the moving technology. And I know sometimes these further marginalized local languages that are spoken by a minority, a smaller group of people. But I think it's going to be an interesting landscape in the next few years of how we take this threat as an opportunity to further explore with the technology that has been implemented.
Okay, I'm aware of time, and I just it's been a very rich session. I would like just to give a few minutes to this. So what next steps? Let's have something more fairly concrete to take out of this. And I'm delighted that we've had some really very concrete suggestions on the kind of research that some of our NGO colleagues might actually be interested in, and also issues that clearly resonate with so many of us as academics: equity, diversity, inclusion, localization. I wondered, in terms of next steps, that there might be perhaps colleagues who haven't had an opportunity to work with NGOs or civil society groups, or have students who would like to do so, if there would be advice on networks, on ways in which they could contact NGOs, and the kind of vocabulary they would need to use in order to do that. I mean, I'm very interested in this sense of, are there networks? I'm thinking about Maggy, for example. There are networks that clearly UKCDR has contact with. I wonder if there's anything you'd like to say about networks that could be useful to academics looking to work with NGOs and civil society groups.
So in terms of network of NGOs, not so much within UKCDR, because our primary audience is the funders.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be able to advise on that. We do work with a range of organizations, and we're connected to Southern Voice, which is a global network of think tanks in the global south, but not so much NGO. But Andrea, I just wonder if through your REF project you came across such networks that might be worth mentioning here?
I'm thinking about the different projects that were revised, but I wasn't exactly sure about in a specific network. I think what used to be very useful for practitioners and researchers working together were using participatory approaches and involving the communities through those. But then also being open to any emerging opportunities. So perhaps there are networks that are not very formalized. We think of networks as, the very formal organization, but sometimes it's also a matter of being in the ground and well, as people have been saying all along, listening to one another and listening to opportunities of going a bit further into achieving what the research project hopes to achieve. Yeah, I'll have a think about networks, but not exactly sure which one to refer to.
Carolina has suggested BOND, which is the UK network for organisations working in international development. But I wonder whether, Angela, you've got something to say about pracademics, we call them, don't we? Networks of pracademics.
That's right. Yeah, there aren't many networks. Bonds I've worked with productively over the years, so I definitely recommend that you go out and check them out. But there aren't many networks, which is why I'm working together with colleagues to set up a network to fill this gap. And it's called the Pracademic Development Initiative, and we define pracademics as those that are active in academia, that have a practitioner background, or that do very applied research, and that work towards social change. And our intentions are to raise awareness of the value of pracademic work, to deepen our understanding of the impact of pracademic work, to promote pracademia as a career path within organisations, because universities often very much undervalue this work, and also to create a community of pracademics. So it's very aligned to what UKCDR are doing in trying to understand the impact of this type of work. And I think that the intention to foster and to nurture collaborative relationships between NGOs and share best practice and lessons learned is something that we're very keen to do. So we've got a special issue coming out in Development in Practice, and it's going to include traditional size articles of 6,000 words, academic articles, but also a series of case studies of pracademic impact, which will be about 2,000 to 3,000 words. And yes, you're right, Vicky. And InTrack, of course, has a historic role in Development in Practice, our chosen journal. So it's relevant to bring that up. So that special issue will be coming out on pracademia, and the case studies of pracademic impact that we have, we hope will be of particular interest to practitioners. But beyond that academic output, we're also arranging a series of events in July at the International Society for Third Sector Research, including not just the normal academic panels, but also fishbowl discussion and a participatory discussion where NGO practitioners will be joining us. They won't be charged a registration fee. And there'll be other things that we have upcoming in the future as well. So if you do want to get involved in that in any way, then Google me at Portsmouth University and we'll link you in. It's something that continues to grow and develop, and would be welcome. Your support would be very welcome to take it to the next stage.
There are a couple of, thank you for that, Andrea. There are a couple of comments in the chat. Following from the previous conversation, has there been research carried out as to the direction of translation interpretation within NGO work? So this is power structures within, from the local to the corporate, or vice versa, especially taking up the idea of localization. It's an interesting question, that. I'm not sure whether anybody feels in a position to answer it. Obviously not at the moment. And Vicky Brim says as well that InTrack, who some of us may know, in Oxford, INTRAC, historically also bridges the gap between the academic and practitioner. So that's also another way in. And I did wonder whether people who've given presentations today might feel willing to engage in some email correspondence with colleagues who are here but haven't actually had an opportunity to speak, and that would be really helpful. I must also say that, and she's going to blush when I say this, that Vina Tesser, whom we've heard quite a lot about, and rightly so today, has a very good resource page. Perhaps I could ask Vina to put the link to that in the chat. Would you do that, Vina, first? It has, I mean, I found it tremendously valuable because it has all sorts of sites which could be useful to us around the issue of empowerment and around other issues. So I think that would be really helpful if you could do that, Vina. Okay, thank you. Sorry, have other people talking as well? Please make sure that I'm asking people to talk. I wonder, sometimes colleagues worry about publications, about working with NGOs and civil societies. How are they as academics going to publish? And I think Angela calls this is a contested institutional terrain, isn't it, in some ways? I don't know whether anybody has any comments on this. I've always felt it's a question of getting out of my comfort zone and daring to look at other publications, but other people may have. Federico, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, I think I do have one that possibly demonstrate my academic independence. I think many of the ideas and projects that we shared today, many of the concerns that colleagues from the NGOs have shared today, also go back to the point of funding. What I find more and more frustrating from the point of view of academic research funders is that they make it very, very difficult to provide direct support to NGO partners in research projects. So funding directly time of already understaffed organizations that, there's more and more suggestion that we should partner, we should do collaborative research, which has impact not as the drive, but as the natural outcome. And then we don't provide the financial instruments to involve colleagues from NGOs, pay them for their time or pay them for replacement time. I find that is more and more frustrating for me. And so speaking with funders, possibly something that as academics we may want to do as a role, taking up that advocacy role. This work is recognized as important, and therefore please do make sure that we can help colleagues to carry it out with us.
Yes, I don't know whether, again, I keep turning back to UKCDR, whether Maggy or Andrea have any comments on the point that Federico was making.
I mean, that's not so much a UKCDR comment, but just a reflection as a former research manager that, yes, indeed, involving partners or other stakeholders in academic research projects is tricky, and defining the right position of those external stakeholders and the type of funding they can receive is not that straightforward. And I just wonder if that doesn't put some academics off involving NGOs or different type of organization, because the funding and the contractual things that goes with it is not necessarily very straightforward.
Yeah. And is that a difficult point to make to funders? Is it in your experience?
We've never really discussed that side of things. We are an organization working with the funders, but we are a step removed from the funders if we want. We provide them with good practice, with evidence-based information to inform what they could do, but to what extent this is then implemented is not down to us. I mean, we are in the area of equity and research partnership, we are working with a range of organizations, and we are trying, especially over the course of 2024, to put together a sort of community of practice with the recognition that it is the entire research ecosystem that needs to change, not just funders or not just how academics work. But this idea that everything is interlinked and it's the ecosystem as a whole that needs to be more considerate about equity. And we are putting together some academics, some funders, research assessment as well, to discuss as a collective how equity can be implemented. So that's a sort of role that UKCDRs play in the systems, the convening role and the providing evidence-based information. Now, we don't go to the funders and say that they should do A, B, and C, but the sort of things that we hope shows from the reports that we produce.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. And very fair. Thank you, Maggy, for that. I think that one thing that perhaps I failed to bring out enough was actually the great pleasure it has been for me personally to work with NGOs and civil societies, and this kind of opening of the mind and dealing with people who are operating in a very different context. And I think whilst we've talked about challenges today, and it's very important to bear those challenges in mind, the opportunities and the the mind opening of working with NGOs for me personally has been extremely interesting, really interesting. And it does strike me that these very good presentations we've had today, and I thank you all for them, underline how important academic research could be to NGOs and to civil society groups. And Andrea's excellent report suggests that much of this has been done. But clearly today we're hearing agendas which are very important in many of our academic institutions too: equity, inclusivity, diversity, localization, and are important in our research. Has anybody got any other comments? I'm aware of the fact that we've gone over the time, for which I apologise. If nobody has, I'm just trying to make sure I haven't wickedly failed to notice something in the chats. I don't think I have. No, but thank you for
Before we go,
Yes.
maybe I can just butt in
Yeah.
and just say on behalf of the institutes, thank you so much, Hilary, for setting this up. I had to miss most of it, but what I caught was absolutely fascinating and also really, really practically helpful. So if there's anything else that the Institute can do as a next step, we would be delighted to.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gudela. And a personal thanks to Kathy Collins, who has managed to keep very calm and organise this very efficiently, despite the people, in my own case, with whom she is dealing. I thank you very much for this. I hope that we're going to see some practical steps forward from this, and I'd be very interested if you could keep in touch and perhaps report back to us what's happening. So many thanks to you all for coming. It's late on Friday afternoon. I apologise for that, but thank you anyway for being here, and have a very good weekend and a well-deserved break. Thank you.